It all started with the nightmares. Dex figured they'd been in the kindergarten for about 2 weeks, and things had been going well. Red band class got easier as Dex ate regularly and worked out daily. His body was becoming toned, strong, and he was catching up with Dick at an alarming rate. Despite being older than Dex, it seemed to gall Dick that Dex was bigger than him. Dex couldn't help it. He'd always been kind of tall, and the muscle made it even more obvious. He'd heard Dick floating the idea that Dex and Ryan might be more than just friends, but he seemed pretty careful to say it out of earshot of Dex or Cutter. Dex had known enough people who were scared of folks to know that, despite being 2 years older than him, Dick was a little hesitant about finding out if Dex could fight or not. Masha, too, seemed to be thriving, and that made Dex feel a lot better about this place. Britt, Jenny, and Daniel now ate breakfast with them, all of them excitedly talking about what they were doing in class that day. Dex laughed at their lessons a few times, liking how it sounded more like play than work. Masha told him that sometimes they did an exercise similar to the telephone, where they would pass a message along and change it a little. Sometimes it got kind of funny, and Masha was barely able to tell them about it without giggling. Dex smiled at her stories, but it was hard not to notice the angry shadow eating not too far away. It appeared that Chandra, the platinum-haired bully of a few weeks ago, had not been having a fun time. For someone who had been such a catty asshole, she had really lost the most in this exchange. Her friends were now eating meals with her enemy, and the teachers had her playing second fiddle to a girl half her age. It was hard not to recognize that she was plotting something. The first time Masha woke up screaming, Dex thought it was just bad dreams. She was sleeping in her own bed now, no longer afraid of being alone, and Dex had been glad that she was settling in. She still spent her evenings with her two best friends, Dunstan and Dex, but she always went back to her bed when it was time to sleep. So when he heard her scream, he was up like a shot, weaving between the beds to get to her. He was afraid that Chandra had made her move, that Masha was being taken away by one of the minders for something strange and a little scary. But when he found her thrashing in her bed, he was almost relieved. She was clutching the covers, tossing and groaning, and he patted her head and tried to soothe her as those sleeping around her sighed and rolled over. Nightmares were something he could understand. Dex didn't wake up screaming, but it was only because he was used to being quiet. Every night he watched Wizard die, and every night he just stood there as it happened. He watched the red spread across his friend, watched it soak into his clothes, watched the life leave his eyes, and then Dex would wake up, only to fall into the same dream again. Some days he worked himself until he was exhausted, and those nights he didn't have any dreams. Those were the good nights, but they didn't happen often enough. He lay there with her that night, giving her what comfort he could, but it wasn't enough. She shuddered awake several times, but that was the only time she screamed on the first night. Dex was tired the next morning, but not as tired as he would come to be the next day. When he asked her about the nightmares, Masha said she couldn't remember them at all. She remembered being tired, she remembered being scared, but she didn't remember why. Just dreams, I guess. I've never really been prone to nightmares, but maybe it's all the brain stuff we've been doing lately. She started chatting with her friends when they came to join them, but Dex wasn't sure he agreed. He tried to talk about it with Dunstan, but he was no help. He looked like he had slept worse than Masha, and when Dex mentioned it, he made a lame attempt at a quip. Maybe she's been poking around in my head. There are definitely some things in there that could cause a few nightmares. When the bell rang a few minutes later, they all shuffled off to class, each looking less sure than the other that they wanted to go. Grab something that seems to speak to you, something that interests you. I want to see if we can get some solid data on your abilities today. Dr. Hammershoal had lined up some objects, and as Dunstan looked at them, he couldn't find a single one that he actually wanted to touch. There was a single Nike trainer on one end, a dirty brown rabbit toy that looked like it had been excavated from a ditch, a transformer that was currently in the shape of a pickup truck, and a frisbee that looked like someone had run over half of it. It wasn't just how they looked either. Dunstan could almost feel something coming off them, a kind of energy he didn't like, and it made him want to touch them even less. "Doc, I don't really want to touch any of these." "Come now, my boy, just a quick touch so we can see what we're working with. You want to know the extent of your powers, don't you?" He did, but these tests had been getting weirder as the days passed. It had been bad enough when he was watching people's lives as their parents fought or people were mugged, but for the last 2 days it had been different somehow. Tuesday, he'd held a wallet that had belonged to a man that had been kidnapped. Dunstan had watched them take the wallet and then saw the man as he went into the trunk of their car. The little doctor had asked him questions after that, and Dunstan had been able to remember the license plate of the car and what color it had been. He told them, and then the next day, there had been a hat on the table. It wasn't a particularly special hat, it was just a battered old White Sox hat, but when Dunstan had touched it, he'd seen a kid about his age walking by the side of the road. The kid had been hitchhiking, Dunstan was almost certain, and when a station wagon with Detroit plates had picked him up, the hat had fallen into the floorboard when he passed out against the window. The kid had put it in his lap, his hands kneading it like a worry stone, and when the kid had been carried from the car into somewhere, the hat had been left behind. Dunstan thought it might have been a hotel or a resort or something, but he couldn't be sure. Now, there were more things, and Dunstan didn't want to touch them. The last two had been different somehow. Dunstan had seen bad stuff before when he touched things, but this was different. He got the idea that Hammershoal knew he would see those things, but now the game had higher stakes. Hammershoal looked interested when he told him about the kid in the station wagon and the old guy in the trunk of the car. He'd scribbled down information and told Dunstan he'd done very well, but Dunstan didn't think he'd been trying to test him. Dunstan suspected that he was using him to gain information. But for what? "I don't know," he said. "Sometimes I see awful things when I touch the stuff you bring in. I don't know if I..." When the rabbit came sailing towards him, Dunstan stuck his hands out to catch it without much thought. He didn't want it to fall on the ground, no more than he wanted anything here to fall off the table, but he realized the trap the second he'd caught it. The second his fingers sank into the plush fur of the filthy toy, he knew he had made a grave error. Dunstan got a flash, and then more than he bargained for. He was walking up the street with a bag of garbage in one hand and the stuffed bunny in the other. No, that wasn't quite right, and Dunstan realized about a second before the kid got snatched that he was seeing things from the swinging perspective of the bunny and not the kid holding it. The garbage fell to the sidewalk, and the kid had a death grip on the rabbit as someone grabbed him up and threw him in the back of a panel van. It was the kind his friends at the group home had always called a candy wagon, with blacked-out windows and heavy sliding doors, and this one seemed to live up to the expectation. No candy, but there was a treat in the back for somebody. The kid cried a lot and clutched at the rabbit as the van rolled off. Dunstan could feel the tears soaking into his fur and wanted to do something. Is this what it was like being a toy? Standing by impotently as some kid who loved you got hurt or killed? If this is what it was like, Dunstan thought the characters in the Toy Story movie would need some pretty big therapy by the end of the series. They drove and drove, the kids' tears coming endlessly, but once they stopped, things got a whole lot worse. The guy opened the doors of the van, letting in light as the kid huddled against the back wall. The light was snuffed out pretty quick, and the guy grabbed the rabbit and tossed Dunstan into the corner as he went to work. Dunstan had a front row seat, the black button eyes seeing every cut, and every scream. When the little hand reached out to grab him, Dunstan felt the kid pull the rabbit close as he wheezed out his final breath. Even in his last moments, he wanted the comfort that rabbit could give him, and when the man took him from the back of the van, he had a death grip on the grubby little toy. They went through the woods, the leaves crunching and the birds singing their hesitant song. Dunstan had seen a sign, Ridgeway Overlook, and when they reached the kid's final resting place, the killer had dropped him like he was nothing but a sack of garbage. The boy was dead, the rabbit slipping from his hand, and Dunstan watched as he dug the hole. He begged, he pleaded to be released from this, but it wasn't until the boy was under the earth that the hand gripped him and took him back to the van. He dropped him not far from the sign, as casually as he had the boy, and that was when Dunstan came out of it. Dunstan dropped the rabbit, letting it fall to the ground, and looked around in confusion. He realized that all that had happened in a matter of seconds, the memories having been imparted just as quickly as he'd reached for the rabbit. He looked at Dr. Hammarskjöld like the man had raped him, and to his credit, Dr. Hammarskjöld had the good grace to look sorry. What the hell was that? Dunstan was shocked to hear how unsteady his voice was. Did you see something? The little man asked. If you saw something, I need to know about it. How could you do that? Dunstan asked, wanting to curl into a ball and resisting the urge with great difficulty. How the hell could you do that? You had no right. You had no... What we do here, Dunstan, is bigger than you and I. We are providing a public service, as well as feeling out your blossoming abilities. Now, tell me what you saw. Dunstan told him, trying to keep his voice from shaking. But when Hammarskjöld told him that he had done well, and he could leave early, Dunstan made his way quickly to the bathroom and threw up. He couldn't believe what he had seen, and it was something that would stick with him for a long, long time. Dex was getting worried about his friends. Masha had been sleeping poorly for the last couple of days. Dunstan had been quiet ever since lessons on Tuesday. Dex had recognized Masha's problem right away, but had been slower to pick up on Dunstan's. Dex was starting to realize just how much of his attention he was giving to the program, and it made him feel kind of crappy. They were sitting in the game room one afternoon, Masha taking a nap on one of the couches as the boys watched cartoons on the big TV. Dex really liked this Adventure Time show, and he was a little jealous of the carefree Finn and his adventures in the land of Uwu. Dunstan was watching too, but he would periodically wipe at his eyes as he watched, crying sometimes, for no discernible reason. "You okay, man?" Dex finally asked him. "Yeah," Dunstan said, his voice watery as runners of snot slid from his nostrils. I don't know what it is, but it's all right. It'll pass. It always does." Dex watched him close his eyes, tears dripping through them, and gain control of himself before sighing deeply and fixing his usual smile back on. "Is it the training?" Dex asked. "Are they making you do stuff that hurts you?" Dunstan opened his mouth to respond, but didn't seem to have an answer right away. I don't really know how to explain it. I told you, I can see things, right? When I touch stuff, I mean." Dex nodded, Masha rolling a little bit as she tried to get comfortable. "Well, they've been giving me some stuff lately. Stuff I don't really want to hold once I have it." "What kind of stuff?" Dex asked. Not sure he wanted to know either, but trying to help Dunstan as best he could. "Kids stuff, toys and stuffed animals and things. At first it was just trucks and action figures and things I could make sense of, but lately it's changed. Today they handed me a stuffed rabbit, and I saw a kid get dragged into a panel van, and they killed him. Like..." Dunstan started crying again, and Dex wished he hadn't asked. "Dude, they really worked this kid over. Then they took him into the woods, and he died as this sick prick dug a hole and put him in it. I watched this kid watching this guy dig his grave. I don't know how to process that, Dex. I don't know what to do with this stuff. Stuff like this scares me. And when I get done, Hammarskjöld wants me to fill out a damn survey. A survey! He yelled, and some of the kids got quiet as they looked at him. Masha woke up, looking scared, as she looked over at Dunstan. Dunstan, what's wrong? Are you okay? Dunstan had gotten off the couch, looking like he wasn't sure whether to run or sit back down. I don't know, he finally told the little girl, and Dex thought for sure that he was going to take a seat again when something over his shoulder caught his attention. His lower jaw was quivering as he watched, and Dex turned to see what had caught him, and saw the news station talking about the remains of a child they had discovered. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but the news prompt said, 10-year-old case closed. Remains of Donovan Kyles found in New Hampshire woods at 3 o'clock this afternoon. The kid pictured couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, but it was the toy he was holding in the featured picture that caught Dex's attention. The stuffed rabbit was pretty jarring after what Dunstan had said, and when he looked back, the boy was bolting from the room. Dunstan came into Dr. Hammarskjöld's office like a bull in a china shop. The little doctor was seated at his computer, making notes on the day's experiments, and he jumped about a foot when the kid came barreling in. Dunstan looked mad enough to chew nails and spit staples, but Dr. Hammarskjöld resisted the urge to just push the button for the security people. He had expected something like this might happen, and it was best to get it out of the way. What the hell? How did they know? How did they know? Dunstan asked. I'm guessing you're talking about Donovan Kyle, Dr. Hammarskjöld said. Yeah, I filled out a survey after you practically shoved that filthy rabbit in my hand, and about a day later they just happened to find the kid? That seems pretty damn convenient to me. Dr. Hammarskjöld locked his computer and turned to give the boy his full attention. It's not convenient at all, Dunstan. Many of the children in this program are used for such matters. Many of your friends in the group are given situations that they may or may not be able to tell the outcome of. Mark is being used to find suspects for various police forces through photographs, fingerprints, and footcasts. Anja is using photos to tell us who might be a potential security threat, though she isn't quite as helpful as you or Mark at the moment. So you see, this isn't just you. We all have our part to play in the grand scheme of things. Yeah, well, my grand scheme requires me to watch kids get butchered, and I don't much care for it, Dunstan said. Dr. Hammarskjöld nodded. I can see where that might be problematic. Would you like me to help you? Dunstan gave him an odd look and took a step back. Help me? How would you do that, exactly? Dr. Hammarskjöld pushed out his chair and offered it to Dunstan. I have a small talent with mental suggestion. I've helped many people your age forget things, lessen the blow of things, become less anxious about things. And I can help you, if you like. Dunstan hesitated, seeming divided over the idea of the little man helping him forget, but ultimately he took a seat. In the end, Dr. Hammarskjöld reflected, they all decided to forget. Now then, count down from 10 for me. Once you reach 10, we may begin. Dunstan was much happier at dinner than he had been in days. He had most of the table in stitches with his quips, but Dex thought his smile looked a little phony. From across the cafeteria, Gerald thought the same, and there was something new as well. A new string linking them now. A purple one. This was the first time he had seen a purple string, and Gerald didn't like it in the least bit. Dunstan would need watching now, and Gerald hoped that he would be up to the task when the time came. I could have flown home, but I thought a drive would clear my head. I'd just finished 4 years in the Marines, 4 of the messiest years of my life. I'd made the mistake of bringing my new wife to California with me, and returned from Iraq to find her warming someone else's bed. The bed in question was of a fellow Marine, someone left on base while I fought and bled for my country. 6 months of staying on base so I could meet with lawyers and finish my divorce, and I was officially out and done. When I told my dad I was going to rent a car and drive home, he understood. I told him I needed to come back slow so I could clear my mind, and he told me to drive safe. "Take your time, kid. We'll be here when you get back," he said, and I took him up on it. I was coming across the country, California to Tennessee, and I was seeing the sights and taking in the local flavor. I had decided to make this a long overdue vacation. I did a lot of things on that trip, but my only mistake was picking the kid up. I was driving through Oklahoma, enjoying the sights and feeling like I could watch the hills and valleys roll by forever, when I saw the kid standing there with his thumb out. He was young, couldn't have been old enough to enlist, despite his army coat. It was July, the heat stifling, but he was wearing fatigues and a service jacket that looked antique. The breeze ruffled his hair, pushing it back in a harsh puff that made me think of kids blowing on dandelion fluff. Maybe it was the jacket, or maybe it was the look of naked want on his face, but I pulled up beside him and rolled the window down. "Hey kid, you need a lift?" He turned his perfect sky blue eyes on me, and I'll never forget his words. Sometimes I hear them in my sleep. "I sure do. Can you give me a lift to McMahon, mister? God'll thank you if you do." I thought that was a little weird, but I told him to climb in, and he did so gladly. The signs told me that McCann was about 30 miles up the road, and I expected the kid to chatter like a squirrel the whole way. To my surprise, he was quiet, his eyes closed, and his head bowed for a couple of minutes. It took me a second to realize he was praying, and when he finished, he sat up and plastered a half-daffy grin on his face. "God tell you I'm a straight shooter?" I asked, more to break the ice than anything. "He said thank you for your assistance, mister, and you'll be greatly rewarded in his kingdom." I nodded, thinking I could use all the help I could get. The farther we drove, the more I began to suspect that something was off about the kid. He stared forward the whole way, his eyes on the horizon, his mouth seemed set in an eternal grin. He wasn't as young as I'd thought, maybe 18 or 19, and the jacket said his name was Harris, had it stenciled right there over the left breast. It was covered in patches, too, the kind you get for service, and I was glancing at one over his right pocket when I saw the bulge under the coat. I felt a cold shudder run through me as I recognized it. The kid was packing. You look a little young for the service, kid," I said, trying to dissuade some of my fear. "Your brother give you that jacket? Was he in Iraq like me?" "My dad left it to me when he died," the kid said matter-of-factly. "Sorry to hear that. Was he in Iraq?" "Gulf War," he said, his voice not matching the grin. "He enlisted before it started and was there a couple of years after it ended." "I bet he had some stories," I said with a nod. I had been about to start in on one of my sandbox tales, but the kid cut me off suddenly with the last thing I expected. "You believe in God, mister?" I blinked, the subject unexpected. "Not really, kid. I'm an atheist. Have been since after what happened to me overseas. I think that if there is a God, it's a pretty crummy thing for him to do, to let us live here like this." I'd expected a fight, but the kid just nodded. "He forgives you for that. Daddy was like you," Mama said, before he went to war. "He saw something over there, bad things, and he came back from the war looking for God. He said he had seen some things over there that scared him, made him want to be better, and he couldn't do better without some help. So he came back and started looking for a purpose, and he found one. He found a lot of people offering purpose, but only one who delivered. By the time I was born, he was part of the family." I listened politely, not wanting to interrupt the kid, but the way he was talking about his dad's search for God made me a little concerned. It didn't seem like a happy memory. I was born into the family. Father Marcus was our everything, our teacher, our preacher, our second father, our salvation. He brought a lot of people together, lots of lost people, but that wasn't enough. Father Marcus wanted more. He had plans, big plans, but they wouldn't turn out to be so good for us. He was quiet for a minute, looking out the glass and seeming lost in thought. I thought again that he had to be a kid, couldn't be out of high school, but maybe it was just whatever was wrong with him. Even though his eyes looked like he was in the worst pain imaginable, he still wore that plastered-on grin, the one that never reached those eyes. He was like a doll with a troubled owner, a doll that smiles through its destruction. When I was 10, Father Marcus told the congregation that the end was coming. He told them that the government was going to come down and take everything that we had built here, and that the devil was set against us, and we needed to escape. He told everybody to sell their things, bring just the bare minimum, and come to a place that he had found. It was a farm on the outskirts of town, a big farm that had once been a dairy. They gave him their money so that he could secure their paradise, free from anything that the government or the devil or anybody else might do, and came there to start their new lives. We were hopeful that this would be our paradise, but it wasn't a paradise. In the end, it was a prison. I felt a chill run up my spine as he said that. I wanted to tell him to stop. I didn't want to hear the end of it, but instead I just listened. The kid was hurting, that was clear enough, but his story was so captivating. It was like one of those true crime stories, the ones so bad that you just know it has to be true. I kept my eyes on the road and listened, just letting him tell it, already knowing that it wouldn't have a happy ending. We were basically his slaves. We worked in the fields. We took care of the animals. We kept the big house where he lived and did his bidding. Father Marcus came down to spit the hellfire every night and to pass down new edicts and rules. Men were not permitted in the big house. No one but Father Marcus could lay with a woman, even within a marriage. All children were Father Marcus's children, but his actual children were special. Eventually, he took all the women that he liked up to the house to populate the earth. He took my sister up there with him, and we never saw her again. People didn't like it much, but what could they do? Father Marcus was keeping us safe from the apocalypse, right? So we followed his orders, till everything fell apart. We rolled into the outskirts of McMahon then, the farms and barns making me think of the place the kid was talking about. I wondered suddenly where we were going, why the kid wanted to go to McMahon so bad. Every mile felt like an eternal march, and I was dreading coming to the end of the journey. Where? I started, but the kid seemed to be expecting the question. Stay on the main road, mister, he said, clearing his throat before going on. He seemed as dry as an old stick, and when I reached behind the seat and offered him a Coke from the cooler, he took it with a smile. I wondered why I'd done that. I didn't want the kid to go on, but in a way I did. I needed the end of it. I needed to know how it had all shook out. I was a curious bastard, it seemed, and I needed to see the bodies in this kid's path. Then one day he gathered us in the barn and told us that the end was near. He told us we needed to prepare ourselves to go because we were meeting God tonight. He gave us all something to drink, something in a red cup that his wives dipped out, and we all drank it. No one argued. No one fought him. We were all so brainwashed that we would have jumped in front of the 6:15 train that ran near the farm if he'd asked. Everyone drank. Everyone obeyed. Everyone went to sleep. They stayed asleep too, except for me. I woke up in the hospital with tubes in my arm and my wrists secured to the bed. The police were there, one of them waiting in the room with me, and they had questions. Turned out that they were the ones who had been coming, not God. They had arrived to find everyone dead, falling around the barn like dolls, but had managed to get there in time to save me. I don't know why I lived while everyone else died, and it ate at me for a long time. Father Marcus, my family, everyone was gone, and I'd been left behind. No one wanted anything to do with me. My dad had burned a lot of bridges before we went into the family, and none of them wanted to take in a moody 16-year-old who'd just been through hell. So, I went into the system, going from group home to group home, till a couple of weeks ago. I clutched the wheel hard, suddenly very worried about what we might find in McMahon. The town was coming up now, a nice old brick town that looked downright picturesque. We passed a sign for a new megachurch, the Sunrise Gospel House, and there was a smiling old man beaming down from the front. The kid shot a glare at him and patted his heart, inevitably patting the piece as well. I suddenly wondered who was in McMahon that this kid needed to see. I was watching TV in the group home, and an ad came on for a church. The church had recently acquired its own network, and the pastor of the church was very familiar. He spoke about peace and God's love, but all I could hear was the voice that told us to drink the juice and go meet God. As I watched him smiling and hugging people, I heard a very different voice in the back of my mind. It was God, the real God, and he told me what I had to do. He said I needed to be his sword, and I needed to cleave the unrighteous from his midst. He patted the gun again, whispering a prayer to God, and my hair stood up on the back of my neck as something strong and strange wafted from the kid. In that moment, he felt very righteous. We were well into town now, rolling up Main Street, and he told me to stop. I dropped the kid off at the light, and he thanked me, said he could make it from here. He gave me a real smile then, not the dopey one he'd been wearing the whole way through as he told his sad little tale, and waved at me. "God bless you, mister. I'm off to do his work." Then he was gone, and I sat there watching him until someone politely honked behind me, and I was forced to roll along. I wasn't sure what to do as I made my way out of town. Did I tell somebody? If this pastor had really messed the kid up like that, then maybe he had it coming. Was that really my call to make, though? In the end, I called the McMahon Police Department and told them what I suspected. I told them about the kid and the story that he had spilled, but I don't think they took me seriously. The dispatcher made it sound like it was going into a little pile of crackpot shit, but I felt I had done my due diligence. I was still thinking about it when I stopped for the night, wondering where the kid was and what he was doing as I drifted off to sleep. I woke up the next day and turned on the news to see that Pastor Michael Wheeler of the Sunrise Gospel House had been shot in front of his congregation. The pastor, someone wanted by the FBI for his alleged connections to several past cults, had been shot by someone from one of his past religious orders. The kid was in custody, but the police were saying he was mentally unwell, and this was likely a retaliation slang. Police were still looking for a mysterious caller who had tipped them off before the shooting, and they had many questions for that individual. I left Oklahoma as quickly as I could, flinching every time I saw a cop. That was a couple of years ago, and I've never told anybody what happened on that trip home. It's something that's weighed on me since I left that kid on Main Street, and I can only imagine that he was right about God blessing me. I came back, found a job that paid well, met the love of my life, and settled into wedded bliss fairly easily. It all seemed very easy while it was happening, and I can't help but wonder if a little divine direction had anything to do with it. As long as he doesn't point me at his enemies, like he did that kid, I suppose we can be square. I was sitting with Randy and Tobias in the security shack, telling them about what I had overheard at the banquet. It was a couple of days after the revelry had ended, and as my head cleared some, I began to remember what I'd heard and thought I might need to tell someone. "I can't believe it," Tobias said. "The lady has been with the summer court for a long time, longer than I've known her. It's unthinkable that Titania would be poised against her. The two of them are like sisters." "I get it," Randy said, as if he was talking to himself. "They get along real well until they act like they're going to kill each other. Plus, it don't sound like Titania's on board with this little scheme." Tobias looked up at Randy as if he were a fool. "The court within Summer is a very tight-knit bunch. The Queen's champion does not break wind without her approval. No, if the Summer champion is plotting against Our Lady, then we have to assume that Titania has approved it." "I think Randy might be right," I said, turning the old goat's attention to me. "When I spoke with Titania in the Grove, she sounded as if she was glad to have the lady back. She spoke highly of her and her court here. I think this may be something under her radar, maybe because she thinks she had such a tight grip." Tobias thought about it for a moment, finally putting his chin in his hands and dropping into deep thought. "Let's hope you two are right. If all of summer and winter are against us, then we're in big trouble." "What makes you think winter is against us, too?" Randy asked, sounding surprised. "If the Green Man attacked us, then Queen Mab was aware of it. She may not have participated, but she was aware. With other courts set against us, we cannot hope to triumph. No, it's better if this is an isolated incident. Though I doubt it." Randy's walkie-talkie cut him off as one of the other guards, maybe Colin, called Randy for assistance. "What's the trouble? We ain't even open for the season yet. Can't be too much going on." "It's the lady. She senses something. Just come to the front gate. You'll see." The three of us went on the run, and we found the lady standing near the front gate, standing as straight as a poker. "Something is coming this way," she said. Her nostrils flared as she turned towards the gate. "Something powerful." Randy reached for his club, something he'd been carrying a lot more than his sidearm lately, and I reached out for my own as I expected trouble. It was morning, the sun was barely up, and there was a deep fog hanging around the park. From within that fog, a figure came, and when I first glimpsed it, the shape was slightly monstrous. Wings and horns and tails seemed to jockey for position on its form, but the closer it got, the more human it appeared. When it stepped out of the fog, I saw it was a familiar figure, the warden of Stragview. The lady stood like a hound who smells a fox, but she seemed to understand that this fox might turn out to be craftier than she could know. The warden, for his part, stood smiling as he took off his spectacles and cleaned them on a handkerchief he kept in his breast pocket. He didn't seem to think he was in any danger, quite the opposite. He smiled at her, setting the glasses back on his nose as they stood like duelists, waiting to strike. He had helped her in the Battle of Winter, but his loyalties, unlike his sister's, were murky and undefined. "Greetings, O Lady of the Growing Things. I wonder if I might come to speak with you about matters of mutual benefit." The lady cocked her head, chewing over his words as if trying to find the poison within the meat. Do I have your assurances of good conduct within my garden? Good conduct towards myself and those in my service?" The warden acted shocked. "Why, of course. What harm would I bring to you? Rest assured, my lady, I have nothing but good intent in my visit today." I kind of doubted this, but the lady nodded, and the warden passed within the gates of the Botanical Garden. The two walked side by side up the sidewalk, saying nothing and merely taking in the sights. Randy and I kept a close pace behind them, our clubs still out, poised to jump to her defense if the need arose. "Are all your guests treated to such an entourage? I feel honored to have your personal guards ensure my safety," he said, turning to nod his head at the two of us as we followed close behind. "It ain't for you," Randy half growled. "The lady has had some strange visitors lately, and we would as soon make sure she's safe." "Loyalty," the warden said with a nod. "I wish I had as much in my own officers, but I fear it is not so. You are blessed indeed, my lady." If she felt blessed, she gave no indication. The four of us walked in silence towards the offices on the east end, and once we had passed through the greenhouses and into a familiar office I had once made very different plans in, Randy and I took our place by the door as the warden and the lady sat across from each other, the desk acting as their chaperone. She looked at him with suspicion, but his was a mask of easy good cheer. When it became obvious that no one was going to suggest refreshment, the warden clapped his hands and gave her his full attention. "Well then, to business, I suppose. My proposal is twofold. The state committee would like to see Stragview do more community outreach. They want more roadwork projects, more work release candidates, and more inmates giving back to the community. I see that your garden has a need of extra hands. As it happens, I have extra hands." "Yeah," Randy cut in, "hands that have only recently come out of cuffs." The warden turned his head, ever so slightly, smiling at Randy in a knowing way. "You remember those cuffs, don't you, Randall? I believe we hosted you for 8 months for, what was it again?" "Some bullshit is what it was," Randy said, taking a step forward. "I was acquitted of those charges, found innocent after being falsely accused, as well you know." The warden shrugged. "Maybe, maybe not. I know we never saw you again after that, so I suppose you might have been innocent. You know that is far from common within Stragview, however. I see to it that most of my sheep are worthy of the fleecing they receive. At any rate," he said, turning back to the lady, "my offer is hands to help with your labor, and an offering of flesh, thrice a year." The lady raised an eyebrow. "You think me incapable of catching my own meat?" "Never think it," he said. "I just believe that if given the chance to eat tourists, or those who have committed heinous crimes, you would choose the side of justice." "I would hardly call what you humans do as justice," she said, but I had been here long enough to know that she was thinking about it. "If I agree, how many will you send to work?" 20, the warden said, clearly having decided on a number already. 30, she countered. 25, the warden said, spreading his hands wide. "Deal. When will they come?" she said. "Well, I can't very well have them here while you have crowds in the park. That might be bad for business, though good for the induction of contraband into my prison. Perhaps I could bring them by after sunset when the park is closed. Would you require the use of my staff to monitor them?" "I would. I should think no more than 2 officers would suffice. How often could they come?" The warden contemplated. "Let us say 3 times a week. Let's say 2 to start, with the option to add more days if I'm satisfied with their work." "Done," the warden said. "Now then, let's discuss your offering. I have a selection of inmates on death row, and my death house is currently not a viable option." He tapped his fingertips, and I got the impression that the death house was closed for more than renovations. The lady nodded. "That sounds acceptable. You can have them brought to the lily pond, and I will dispose of them for you." The warden nodded. "Very good. For this to be official, we will, of course, have to go before the city and enter an agreement together. After that, I can have a work crew here the very next night, if that suits you." The lady nodded, emotion slow and contemplative. "And the first offering?" He scratched his chin, pretending to think about it. "Tomorrow night?" She nodded again. "That sounds wonderful." The warden rose, offering her a hand. "A pleasure doing business with you," he said, and she extended a hand and shook it slowly. He turned to look at us, his eyes falling on Randy with glittering maliciousness. "Good to see you made something of yourself, Randall. I trust your work keeps you out of trouble." Randy didn't answer, but I heard the wood creak as he gripped his cudgel much too hard. "Well then, I shall see you at the council meeting next week then," he said, walking between us as if we were no more than bat-winged doors, and exited the office. Randy was furious, but he still waited to hear the door close behind the warden before grabbing his walkie and calling the security staff in the area to make sure their visitor went out the front gates and didn't linger. "I can't believe you'd just accept his deal," Randy said, and I thought it might have been the first time I'd ever heard him raise his voice to the lady. "Don't you know what that man is?" "A creature of flame and shadow, something as inconsequential to me as his siblings. I was old when they drew their first staggering breaths, and I will be new when they are bones and dust. He does not impress me, Randall. Does he you? Is that why you are so frightened of him?" "Frightened?" Randy breathed the word out like it was bitter smoke. "Frightened of who? That old goblin? Never was and never will be," he said, but I saw the truth. Beneath the bluster and bravado, there was a scared man who was barely out of boyhood, and another man who towered over him like a monster, and still scared him when he thought back on those troubled times. Regardless of what he is, he offers us something good, and he will mean I have to take fewer of our customers, something I know you have never liked. Those sentenced to death by your people are also guilty for a near certainty. Is it not so?" Randy looked like he wanted to say a great many things, but he settled for, "They are, usually. Mistakes are made, but it's hard to put a man to death if it isn't absolutely certain." "Then it shouldn't matter if we take them. Their sacrifice will make us strong, and that strength will help us fight the fights to come." Randy looked away, not seeming to like the taste, but accepting the draft. "Go, and make sure our home is secure. I will have need of you both very soon. I'm glad you think enough of me to be worried for me, but fear not. I have been getting the better of creatures like this warden for longer than either of you have been alive. The old hyena is not as crafty as he thinks he is, and he will find me less naive than he believes me to be." We left then, bowing low, and it seemed we had a new ally, for better or for worse. "Keep your eyes peeled, kid," Randy said to me as we came out of the building and into the sun. "Seems there are enemies everywhere these days, and we have to be on guard." We parted ways then, going about our individual watches. It appeared we had some things to prepare for before tomorrow night's execution. I was walking home from Susan's house, thinking about what Terry had told me, when the squad car pulled up next to me. I breathed a sigh of relief when I saw the nose of the cruiser, but only until I remembered what Terry had told me about the sheriff. I had thought someone had been following me for a while, and I had been worried that it would turn out to be a creep or something. The sight of the cop car should have filled me with relief, but it made me more than a little nervous as the eyes of the driver turned to me. I thought maybe they were just checking on a call or something, but when the driver rolled the window down, I saw that it wasn't just any patrolman. The sheriff hadn't changed much in the time I'd been gone, though it appeared he had lost a little more hair and added a few more wrinkles. He had congratulated me on my heroism when I came back, shaking my hand as I stood between he and the mayor, receiving my placard. That being said, I think even as a kid I had recognized that his good-natured smiles never went all the way to his eyes. He was calculating, and you could see it working on him, even as he grinned at me through the window of his car. "Where you heading?" "Just heading home, Sheriff," I answered, trying not to sound guilty and mostly just sounding unsure of myself. "Why don't I give you a ride?" he offered, reaching over to open the passenger side door. The offer was tempting, but I honestly didn't want to be stuck in a car with Sheriff Mackenzie. Not if I could help it. "That's okay," I said, as I tried to keep the apprehension out of my voice. "It's not far, and I like to stay in shape." As I took another couple of steps, he pulled the car up alongside me, the smile deteriorating ever so slightly. "You're right. It's not that far, and I just want to see how you're settling into civilian life. Come on, let an old one-horse town sheriff live vicariously through a great war hero for a minute." I remembered what I'd been thinking earlier, about how the sheriff might be dangerous, and decided that it might be for the best to just accept the ride. He wasn't going to kill me on the street. He had no reason to. Wasn't doing anything wrong. Hadn't been doing anything wrong. And the idea that he might hurt me was stupid. I was a local celebrity, someone who could handle myself if he decided to get violent, and we both knew it. Even so, it was hard to forget what Terry had told me about the sheriff and the mayor, that they seemed to have all the power these days. The only other thing in town that seemed to have power were the foresters, and I was way less afraid of some small-town lawman than the creatures that snatched the town's children. I climbed into the cruiser and tried to look comfortable as we drove towards my house. "So how you adjusting? Picking up where you left off?" "I suppose so," I told him. This was a strange line of questioning, especially considering we had never interacted before I got back from Iraq. I'd seen him at assembly sometimes when I was in high school, or coming to talk to the principal about some hell-raising that had gone on the night before, but I think this was probably the first conversation I'd ever had with Jerry Mackenzie. "We haven't seen you at the local events lately. We were worried that maybe you were having some trouble coming back to civilian life. It's not good for the town morale when a local legend is having trouble fitting in." "I've just been busy," I told him, almost absent-mindedly. "Working for Camber and Son, being in the woods 5 days a week, trying to get back to life I barely started before I left." Mackenzie smiled knowingly. "I say we were worried, right up until we noticed you were hanging around the bookstore owned by your old flame. She's a good-looking girl. You should feel very lucky." That got my neck hair up a little bit. Had they been watching me? Why had they been watching me? I was, as far as any of them knew, a hometown hero. What reason did I have to be under surveillance by the sheriff of Rayffered? It all smacked of something a little sinister, and I didn't like it. "Seems like you've been getting cozy with the Brenham family," he said, almost too low for me to hear. "Sorry?" I said, turning to give him my full attention as he spun the wheel lazily. "We see you running errands with our Uncle Terry. That is company you might want to be careful around." I opened my mouth to say more, but he drove past the road that would have taken him to my house, and I watched it disappear with a sense of dread. "Hey, you missed my turnoff, Sheriff." "Did I?" he asked lazily, flashing me a smile. "Oh, well, there's someone else that wants to have a word with you anyway. A very important person has asked me to facilitate a meeting between the two of you, and he's not the kind of man you say no to when he wants something." I wanted to argue, but there wasn't really much I could say. I tried the door and found that it was locked. I didn't want to cause a scene by trying to jump out of his car in the middle of traffic, not being sure I could unlock the door in his cruiser anyway. I went along for the ride, figuring I'd learn soon enough who wanted my attention. Mackenzie took a few roads seemingly at random, and as we pulled into the nicer part of town, I was unsurprised when we came to rest outside the mayor's house. Mayor Register had one of the largest houses amongst the 5 or 6 in that subdivision. It wasn't a mansion, not really, but it likely had about twice as many rooms and 3 times as much square footage as my parents' house hosted. I was sure there was a swimming pool in the backyard, an amenity that very few had around here, since the forest seemed to send its roots searching everywhere. As I climbed out of the cruiser, I thought about running. It wasn't like he was going to shoot me in the street, but then I remembered what Terry had said about people the mayor thought were interfering with the forest and its denizens. The foresters aren't the only ones who make people disappear in this town. Come on, Sheriff Mackenzie said, as if guessing what I was thinking. The mayor just wants a quick word. I promise we'll have you home before sundown. As little as I wanted to, I went with him into the mayor's palatial home. We came in through a foyer that looked bigger than my barracks at Basic and walked through a sitting room that led to a kitchen that led out to the backyard. The kitchen had amenities in it that I'd never seen before, and the whole thing looked like the galley on a spaceship. There was indeed a pool in the backyard, and sitting at one of the little tables poolside was Mayor Register. He was wearing part of his usual steel blue suit. The coat hung across the back of the chair he now occupied, and his white shirt seemed to cover his small frame like a funeral shroud. He had shrunk some in the time I had been gone, his age finally catching up with him, and he didn't look well. His skin kind of hung on him, the color looking off, and I suspected that he might be wearing a toupee. He looked up as we came to the side of the pool, waving us over as he took a drink of something from a large glass. I thought it might have been beer, but as I got closer, I noticed that it was thick and not altogether healthy looking. Want one? The mayor asked, seeing me looking at the glass. It's a health shake from somewhere overseas. Tastes terrible, but it's as good as a meal, and it's supposed to stave off cancer and all sorts of things. Haven't got it yet, so maybe it works. I told him I would pass and took a seat in the chair across from him. Sheriff Mackenzie loomed on my left shoulder, and I got the suspicion that he was preparing to intercede if needed. What was he afraid I was going to do exactly? Did he think I was going to kill the mayor for inviting me over for a drink? The whole thing seemed even stranger the longer it went on, and I almost felt like I should have a hat in my hand as I met with this Mayor Don. We were just curious to see how you were getting along, the mayor said as he took another sip from his glass and grimaced. When I came back from college, it was so difficult to return to the normal humdrum life of Rayffered. Once you've been out of town, it all just seems so small, and you've been farther than most. I would have preferred to meet with you in my office, but it appears you're a hard man to track down these days. He looked at me over the rim of his glass, trying for a playful disapproval, but coming off as somewhat daffy. I mean, I said, feeling like I needed to make explanations for my busy schedule. I've been in the woods most days, working for Camber & Son. Otherwise, I'm just enjoying my downtime, trying to get back into civilian life. And the civilians you left behind, Sheriff Mackenzie said dryly. Don't be crass, Jerry, Mayor Register said. We had noticed you spending a lot of time with old friends, maybe making some new ones. He took another long sip from the glass, and when he looked up, all the goodwill was gone. What can you tell me about Terry Bremen and his latest writing project? He asked, his tone sounding less playful than it had before. You would know better than I would. He sits on the council with you and the sheriff, doesn't he? The mayor steepled his fingers before his eyes, a distinctly wizardly-looking gesture. If I can be honest with you, Terry hasn't been himself for the last couple of years. Since his wife died, he's been very distant, and he's been talking to people that I would rather he not talk to. He's been working on books for the last 3 years. Do you know that? One of them he started before his wife died, but the other one is a ledger about those who have been lost to the foresters. I've asked him several times why he feels he needs to write such a book, and every time he tells me the same thing. It's to honor the dead, and the dead should be honored for their sacrifice. Maybe you agree with him. I know you lost a brother to the Foresters, but if a book like that ever got out, people might start looking at Rayffered in a different light. No one believes the crackpots that try to tell stories about forest people that steal children after dark. We live in the new world, and no one believes in boogeymen anymore. No one except your friend, Terry. If you want him to stop writing the book, I said, unable to keep the chill out of my voice, then why don't you just ask him yourself? It's within your power to tell him not to write about town history, I would assume. I heard Sheriff Mackenzie move in an agitated way, but Mayor Register put a hand up, stopping him from doing anything unwise. The man was still smiling, but I noticed it never went to his eyes. His eyes were cold and flinty, like the rock that they dug out of the quarry, and I realized Terry might have been justified in his fears about this man and his lackey, and what they could be doing. So far, Terry hasn't broken any rules. He's a member in good standing of the Historical Society, and as such, is well within his rights to write about history. I just think someone might give him some good advice when it comes to doing things that might end badly for him. No one wants to see an end to what we have here. Forest gives us everything we need, and it keeps your father and the company he works for employed. Keeps your friends at the logging company employed. It even keeps you in funds. Be a real shame if something put it all to an end and ruined it for everyone else. Don't you think? I spoke before I could think better of it. And those kids that they take to the forest, what are they? A reasonable loss so the good times continue to roll? The mayor shrugged, and that was all the answer I needed. We all feel terrible about the people that go missing, but what's the alternative? Mayors before me have tried to fight back, and it never does any good. Would you rather that the Foresters come and take the whole town? No, this is better. We lose a few people, but the gains keep the town alive. Besides, they never take more than they need. I wanted to tell him that was a lie, but it made me think of something I hadn't before. Was there a set amount that they took? Some constant in their theft? I'd always assumed they just took what they wanted, but maybe there was a number, a quota, an end. The mayor drained the cup in a single pull, shuddering as he fought to keep it down. He flapped a hand at me, clearly done with the meeting, and suddenly Sheriff Mackenzie had a hand on my shoulder, and I was being escorted out. It appeared we were done here, but when he raised his voice as I was being frog-marched around the pool, we both stopped. "Oh, before you go, I would consider it your civic duty to report on anything Terry Bremen might be doing that would endanger the town. Otherwise, we might decide you are an accomplice, and that wouldn't be great for your status as a town celebrity. The winds can change at a moment's notice in Rayffered. Be sure you're catching the tailwind, instead of being plummeted to the earth." The ride to my parents' house was extremely awkward, but as the sheriff's car rounded the corner, I was already off and running. Sundown was still hours away, and I needed to let Terry know what I had learned. It appeared his paranoia wasn't unfounded. I grew up outside of Copenhagen. Most of my life spent on my father's sheep farm. It's beautiful country if you've never been, and I can think of no better place to spend my childhood. The rolling hills and forests are perfect for playing knights or policemen or whatever a child may want. The trees became my castles, the underbridges my banks or shops to chase robbers from, and I spent the hours outside of my chores letting my imagination run wild. That imagination was probably why no one believed me when I told them about the ravens. I'd been telling tales since I was very young. I claimed I'd seen fairies dancing around a mushroom ring. I'd seen a parade of lights that had turned out to be the procession of Queen Mab. That I had seen dinosaurs in the forest, and black dogs, and kelpies, and all sorts of things. I loved stories, so I wanted to see something magical. The world was often such a dour place that I prayed for a little magic in my life, and created it until I could find my wish fulfilled. I was 9 when I found some of that magic, but I wasn't quite as ready as I believed I was. My grandparents lived less than a mile from our farm. Their property was at the back end of ours, truth be told, and when my gran called and said she had just baked a bunch of cookies and was hoping I could come help her eat some of the extras, I turned hopefully to my mum and asked if I could go over for some cookies. Mum asked if my chores were done, and I said they were. It was summer. I wouldn't have to go fill the sheep feeders till after dinner. I'd been diligent through the day, and now my midday was mine to do what I liked. "You may," Mum said, "but put on your slicker and your wellies. It looks like rain." A few minutes later, I was set out in my duck-yellow slicker with my big green rubber gum boots on an adventure to Grandma's house. I found a stick on the way, my sword for this quest, and I was cutting through the sheep fields and heading for the little path between the fields. It was a place I liked to play sometimes, and my grandfather had told me it had once been the site of a great battle. He said old Danish kings were known to make war on each other, and the land around Copenhagen had seen a lot of bloodshed over the years. The area between the farms, but a quarter-mile of dirt road, was said to have been the site of several skirmishes, and I wonder now how many had lost their lives there. As a child, however, it was just fun to think of knights fighting each other as their steel clanged and the horses whinnied. I heard the thunder rumble, something that was not the loud sound of hooves charging forward, and thought that Mum was right. The rain would be coming soon. If I didn't want to get wet, I needed to hurry. Getting wet wasn't really something I was too worried about, but Gran liked to keep the house nice and dry, and a wet little boy was likely to be asked to leave after he'd eaten only a few cookies. I came out onto the road, racing the rain, but I wasn't alone. Perched on the wooden fence which separated the road from the fields were ravens. I don't mean crows or blackbirds. I mean ravens. If you've never seen them together, then you might not understand, but ravens are quite a bit larger than crows. They are more than a little scary looking too, especially to a child not yet 10. I expected they would take flight when I came onto the road, but they did not. They sat looking at me like hateful old men watching a trespasser, and it was clear that they would not leave simply because I was there. They were proud birds, and this was their place, and it was I who was the interloper. It was spooky, but I wasn't really afraid of them. I was a little scared. There were a lot of them, and I was a small boy, but I didn't think they would hurt me. These were no boogeymen, no trolls or goblins, and they were more spooky than scary. Papa put out straw men to keep these devils out of the garden. They were birds, and birds couldn't hurt me. "Boy," said a voice, and I froze in my tracks. "Boy," it said again, and I looked around to see who had spoken. Was it one of the ravens? Ravens could speak. I'd heard that somewhere, and maybe these ravens had picked up a word or two. Mum said ravens were smart after all, so it wasn't that hard to imagine that it could be them talking. I kept walking, trying not to look at them as I went. They were just birds. They didn't want anything from me. Birds didn't talk to people. They just, "Boy, stop!" the same croaky voice said. That drew me up short. The bird had told me to stop, so I had. I felt a chill run up my spine as I turned to look at the group of crows. A murder. It was a murder when it was crows. And I saw one that was different. His feathers were white. They weren't gray. They were snow white. His beak and legs were black, the color his feathers ought to be, but his eyes were the most frightening part of him. They were red, like a rat's eyes, and they stared at me with far too much intelligence. We just stood there for a while, staring at each other as the thunder built overhead, and I started to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. It was still just a bird, so it had two words. What of it? Didn't mean it was different from the rest or anything. "Thank you, boy," it said, its speech perfectly understandable, if not a little raspy. "I was not sure you would stop for a moment. I have to ask a favor of you, but in return I will grant you any wish you desire." I looked around, expecting to see someone standing nearby throwing their voice, but it was just me and the ravens. The thunder rumbled again overhead, but the rain coming on fast behind me was the least of my concerns. Now I was more worried about the talking raven with the white feathers. I started to say, not sure how to answer. "Are you talking to me?" The raven appeared to chuckle, a clicking sound that the others picked up quickly. "Well, who else would I be talking to? You and I are the only ones talking out here, are we not?" I nodded, supposing that was so. "So I am here to offer you your heart's desire in exchange for a favor of my asking. Do you agree?" I started to nod. I was very close to just nodding before learning more, but Papa had always been very clear about blindly accepting things. Papa was a man who had worked to get where he was, and he always told me to be wary of deals that seemed too good to be true. Anyone who wants you to sign on the dotted line without letting you read the contract is trying to trick you out of something, and it's often something you wouldn't want to try to live without, he would say, and I remembered his words in the nick of time. "How is it that you can talk?" I asked, and the bird ruffled a little at the question. "Well, ravens are smart, everyone knows this, but I am a Valravn, and I am smarter than any of my brethren. Do you know why?" I did know why, as it happened. Grandfather had told me about the Valravns, just as he had told me about the trolls and the gnomes and the other magical creatures that inhabit our old world. "Valravns are ravens that have eaten the flesh of a king," I said, and the bird seemed to smile as much as a beak could smile. "Very close, boy. Valravns have eaten the heart of a king. It was right here, actually, a very long time ago. Would you like to hear about it?" I nodded. "Very much. My grandfather told me this place had seen many battles." "Your grandfather is wise," the white bird said. "I was barely in my first year when I saw the pinions and banners waving. We were more interested in the men carrying them, however, my murder and I. In those days, when men with banners went somewhere, They were often bodies in the place where they stopped to do battle. Banners we were following that day. They did not do well, and we fell on them after the fighting was done and ate our fill. I found him then, the man with the shiny hat. I did not know he was a king, not then. I only knew that his hat had caught the light when the sun came out from behind a cloud, and it drew me to him. His armor was broken, and his blood was running free. Someone had pierced his heart with a lance, and I ate it happily. It was meat, and meat was good. But as I ate, I began to know things. I knew that the meat was a heart, and the hat was a crown, and the king was named Lenthal. His castle was far from here, in a place called Wales, and he would never go home again. Never again. I also knew something else. I knew I would never die until I gained what I needed. I would never truly live. That is why I need you, boy. You have what I need, and to get it, I am willing to make a deal with you. Whatever you desire shall be yours, but only if you agree to give me what I need. For the second time that day, I was prepared to agree. My family was not rich, though we were better than most, and there were things I needed, just like any child. A new bike, a box kite, a real sword, a horse, a stable of horses. I could have anything I wanted. The Valravn was magic. Grandfather had said so. But as I opened my mouth, I remembered something else Grandfather had told me. The Valravn is a smart but tricksy bird. It knows it can only be human if it gains what it most desires, he had said, puffing his pipe as he sat before the fire. And what does it most desire, Grandfather? I asked, scooting a little closer as I waited for him to tell. I expected it to be treasure or a magic book or true love or something from the usual stories, but it was much worse than that. My grandfather leaned back and looked me in the eye as he delivered the answer, and I realized now that it had been intended to scare me. Grandfather believed in the things he talked about, trolls and redcaps and Valravn, and he wanted me to be wary of them as well. After that night, I certainly was wary, and it surprises me now that it took me so long to remember that night as I sat before the fire, listening to the tales. A child's heart, he almost whispered, and as I stood there in the road, I heard that same whisper creep up my spine like a spider in the dead of night. "Do we have a deal?" the Valravn asked, but I was already backing away. I shouldn't have talked to it. I shouldn't have stopped. And as I began to run, I heard the Valravn quark angrily as the murder took flight. I was running as fast as I could, the raindrops beginning to fall as my feet ate up the ground. I could see the lane that would take me to my grandparents' house, but it looked miles long as the beat of wings sounded behind me. There were so many of them, a whole murder of them, and I fancied that my slicker rustled as they dove at me. The rain was falling hard now, the drops becoming a downpour, and I expected their talons to find me any minute. When the angry quark began to sound behind me, I looked back to see them flying drunkenly as the rain soaked them. Later I would find out that birds don't usually fly in the rain because it makes their feathers heavy, which makes their movements difficult and their steering and maintaining flight almost impossible. If they had come after me on a sunny day, I would have been ripped apart. Ravens are large, and in such numbers, I would have been unable to hold them off. Instead, the rain thwarted them, and I made it to my grandparents' house in one piece. Grandma was a little miffed at the mud and the water that I had tracked in, but I think she realized something was wrong when she found me curled up in a corner of her mudroom in tears. She asked me what had happened, clearly afraid that someone had tried to snatch me or some such thing, but I just kept shaking my head and whispering, "Valravn, Valravn," until she called my grandfather from the den and asked him what I was saying. Grandfather listened. He nodded, and then he took me in his arms and brought me into the den to sit by the fire. Grandmother came in a few minutes later with cookies and milk, and we sat and listened to the rain, Grandfather asking me if I'd seen one of the tricksy birds. I nodded, and he nodded in return. That was all that was ever said about it. After my cookies were eaten, he put me in his old truck and took me home. We never spoke of it again, and it was never brought up between anyone after that. The thing about the tattoo that I hate the most was the way it itched. I could live 1,000 years, and I'd still remember that itch. Hadrian said it itched because she wanted us to do something. The itch meant that our work wasn't done. The itch that woke you up at night, that made you wince in the chow hall, that burned as you lifted weights in the yard. That was her telling you that you needed to work harder for her, and that she had more for you to do. You had only to look at the angry red words on your body to know that she was displeased. I came to Stragview after a series of failed burglaries. I was a simple creature back then, not thinking past my next meal and my next hit of meth. I lacked direction. I lacked focus, but Stragview fixed all that. When the cops picked us up with stolen property, driving around in stolen property, I thought my luck had turned bad. But I was content to do my 5 years and get back to what I knew best: drugs and theft. The drugs were how I met Hadrian, and how I got hooked on something worse than meth. I remember the first time I met him, like it was yesterday. I had been inside for nearly a month, and I was still dope sick. You have to remember, I came into this world with meth in my blood, and this was the longest I'd ever been without so much as a contact high. I was pale. I'd lost a lot of weight. I wasn't shaking as bad as I had been, but it was still less than steady. I felt like death might be preferable to another 4 years and 11 months of this mostly white-knuckle sobriety. Hadrian saw me sitting in the shade, spilling more water on myself than I was drinking, and offered me the one thing I couldn't refuse. I thought I was seeing things when he put the baggie in my hand, and I would have gladly wrung his neck when he pulled it out of my reach just as fast. "First, hoss, you do a little something for me." I'd seen enough prison stuff to know what he meant, but I was wrong in this case. What he wanted me to do was keep a lookout while he and some of his associates boosted something from the rec office. I don't even remember what it was, something I didn't put much value in, and when he gave me the baggie and something I could smoke it with, I was ready to cry. I felt normal for the first time in weeks that night, and Hadrian invited me to do more work with him the next day. We could use some new blood like you, kid." And when I asked about the organization, he lifted his sleeve and showed me that red, angry-looking tattoo, the one that said Jesse. I told him I hoped he hadn't paid much for that, and he just laughed in a way that let me know it was funny, but in a sad way. "I think sometimes I paid too much for it, but it's our ticket out of here. She's gonna free us, kid, and if you're with us, she'll free you too." I rolled my eyes back then, just glad to have my fix back, but soon I would come to understand. It took a couple of months, but eventually I found worth there. I woke up one morning to the strangest pain of my life. It was a burning, an itching, like I was being tattooed from the inside. It burned, the angry fire bubbling up against my skin. And as I gritted my teeth, I saw some of the people around me look over at me curiously. I thought maybe I had contracted scabies for a moment, something that was going around the dorm, but when I rolled back my sleeve and saw the raw red name of Hadrian's lady, I was furious. That bastard had tattooed me in my sleep. He had tattooed me, and I had never even woken up. I was furious, and when I saw him in the line for chow later, I put him against the wall between the foam bank and asked him what the hell he thought he was doing. He looked confused, but when I lifted him against the wall, my sleeve had come back and he noticed the fresh ink. He smiled, despite his position, and told me that she had found me worthy. I was so confused that I let him down, telling him that he better start explaining, and fast, before I beat his face in. Hadrian did not look particularly worried. That day, he told me about Jesse, the one he served. In the beginning, the marks were a death sentence. When they appeared, they were a sign that Jesse was coming to take your life force, and your days were numbered. Then the warden scattered her, something he had done before. But when she came back, she was different. I was one of the ones to keep my mark from that cycle, and instead of taking my life, she decided to make use of it. So we do things for her, so that when she comes back, she'll help us. Jessie is our muse, our goddess, and one day we will see her made flesh again. This went on and on and on, but I had to admit that Hadrian was persuasive. Why does she need a body? If she can act as a ghost, then why wouldn't she just stay a spirit? She's been a spirit for a long time, Hadrian told me, many of his disciples nodding, and she's trapped here for as long as she remains a spirit. If she hopes to escape, she needs a real body, and to do that, she needs our help. That was the start of my indoctrination. Hadrian was as good as his word, and the gang thrived. No, not a gang, I guess. A cult was more like it. We began to work immediately. Hadrian had a strange collection of things he needed, and very little of it made sense to me. He needed a nurse's uniform for medical. He needed a pair of stockings, which we also got from a nurse in medical, though not the same one, and a tube of red lipstick, which we filched from a volunteer in the GED program. After that, the requests became stranger and harder to fulfill. When he told the grounds crew that he needed a pocket of grave soil from the on-site graveyard, that one raised a few eyebrows. When he told the kitchen guys that he needed a handful of lard, they blinked at him, but provided. He asked for pig's blood, for holy water from the chapel, and finally, for something likely to get us all killed. He gathered us up around the card table one night, the TV blaring behind us as he laid out his most daring plan yet. "Gentlemen, we are so close to being able to bring Our Lady back from the beyond. She is proud of all of us," he assured us, his arm scratching, sort of putting that to question. "But this is going to be the biggest test of our mettle. We're going to steal from the warden's tower." We all got very quiet, and when Pete spoke up, I felt it properly encompassed what we were all thinking. "Are you fucking high?" Hadrian smiled at Pete indignantly. "No, Peter, I am not. I have information from one of the contacts amongst the guards. He has it on good authority that the warden will be in town next Tuesday for a city council meeting. He's trying to get a new initiative pushed through so he can get inmates into the Botanical Garden, and he and the woman who chaired that particular panel have to meet with the council to get approval. It's the best chance we have to get the thing we need, and it may be our only chance to take it without being noticed." He laid it out like it was a heist in some movie, and we were going to Ocean's 11 all the money from the vault and walk out with our hands clean. There was a certain item, a locket, that we needed to complete the ritual. It was in the warden's private collection, a trophy cabinet of sorts, the last she knew, and she needed it back to reform her body. We were going in, posing as custodial inmates, and would clean the entryway and buff the floors, with a few of us going up to clean the office. We would be under supervision, but our babysitter would be one of the guards, the ones in our pocket. We would be in and out in an hour. The longest part would be buffing the floor. "No one'll be the wiser," Hadrian promised, smiling in his fatherly way. "Yeah," Charlie said, a little thief from Tiger, "up until the warden comes back and notices it's missing." "Have a little faith, Charles." Charlie snorted. "I done enough breaking and entering and stealing from people to tell you that they don't lock it up if they ain't gonna miss it. If this locket is in a trophy case, then you better believe that he knows every pockmark and grain of dirt on that thing. Once he notices it's gone, he's gonna turn this place upside down, and when he finds it with us, well, I don't like the scuttlebutt I hear about that guy." Some of the guys around the table were nodding, telling Charlie he might have something, but Hadrian would not be put aside so easily. His nostrils flared, but he kept his composure in place. "Charles, how long are you doing on that string of B&Es? 8 years? 6 with good behavior," Charlie answered, but he didn't seem to like the taste of it. "Peter, you're doing 12 on an attempted murder charge, right?" Peter pursed his lips and nodded, looking like he'd eaten a lemon. "You're all doing serious time, and I think our new friend here has the shortest sentence at 5 years. There's a risk here, that much is certain, but the reward," he dragged the word out until it sounded dirty, "the rewards are freedom, benediction, and purpose. You want to make certain your women don't find solace in another's bed, don't you? That your children don't forget your face, that your fortunes do not remain hidden in the places you have put them for safekeeping. Well, this is the way to ensure that. Come with me and forge your own path away from this hellhole." His words moved them, and it was decided to a man that they would go along with his plan. Hadrian laid it all out for them. There would be 8 of us, a standard cleaning crew. John, Frank, Pete, and Mac would stay below to wax the floors, or cover should anyone ask questions. Charlie, Marcus, Hadrian, and I would go up to the office, clean it, get the thing, and get out quickly as possible. We'd be in and out in under an hour, well before the warden returned, and we'd have the locket hidden before it was noticed. We all nodded, and the heist was struck. As Tuesday came closer and closer, I started getting nervous. This was easily the most nerve-wracking weekend of my life, and I spent most of it just walking around inside the dorm. I just kept going over the plan again and again and again in my head. John, Frank, Pete, and Mac would stay below to wax the floor. Charlie, Marcus, Hadrian, and I would go upstairs and clean. We'd get the locket and be gone before it was noticed. As I paced, these facts ran around and around in my brain, and when Hadrian spoke up from behind me, I wondered how long he'd been walking there. Stiff upper lip, boy. This'll be all over soon. In the meantime, try not to look so guilty, eh? He said with a chuckle. I laughed, mine nervous and less confident, but I felt like throwing up more than anything. When Tuesday came, a guard I'd never seen came to get us and took us to the maintenance shed near B-dorm. He had jumpsuits, the kind that custodial guys wore, and told us the warden had left for town about an hour and a half ago. We have about 3 hours, gentlemen, if we're lucky, and I want to be out of there before then. Understood? I love the lady just as much as you do, Hadrian, but I won't risk the warden's wrath over that love. That man may be flesh and blood, but he scares the shit out of me. Hadrian had patted him, assuring him that it would be okay, and to keep faith. We set off 15 minutes later, pushing our mop and floor buckets and floor buffer and implements of destruction. I looked at the tower as it rose before me, an imposing giant that did not seem to have any love for me. Pete had told me that the tower had once been a rat-infested relic, that it was good for nothing but storing furniture. It had been cleaned out and cleaned up, and now the warden practically lived there. He had set up shop there and used it as a watchtower for the whole compound, sitting on the catwalk at all hours of the night and just watching people as they went by. Felt like he was watching us now, and that was not something that filled me with confidence. We got inside, the guard using one of the big ugly keys they often carried, and the floor crew set to work on the waxing. They opened the doors, the buffer making a lot of noise as they set to the recently tiled floor. They were talking, joking around, making it look natural, and we moved upstairs as they got to it, getting about the real business. Okay, quick, the guard said, unlocking the door and letting us in to clean. The office took my breath away. It looked like nothing so much as an old English study, the floor covered in ceiling-to-floor bookshelves, and surrounding a huge dark wood desk. There was a green glass lamp on it, the kind you might see in a bank or an antique store, and the blotter had dates and things written on it in a neat hand. We set to cleaning, but there was really no reason to look very far. Set into one of the bookshelves was a lighted display case with a number of things in it. I could see a couple of lockets, a pocket watch, a set of cufflinks, and a totem carved out of stone that gave me a shudder. There were a lot of other things in there too, but I realized it wouldn't be that hard to find the locket we were looking for. There were only 3, and I had to assume it was the one lying open, with the picture of the nurse inside. The case was locked, but we had prepared for this. "You're up, Charlie," I said, and the little thief went to work. I had been a B&E guy, but Charlie claimed that breaking and entering was just a hobby for him when times were hard. He was actually a locksmith and a safe cracker, and he claimed to have opened a safe for the same bunch of officers that had arrested him when they got it into evidence. Their good opinion of him had only lasted until they caught his prints on 8 burglarized condos, and that had been the end of his reputation. He set to work with some pretty unorthodox tools, careful as he could be not to damage the lock or the cabinet. We were cleaning, but we were also watching Charlie as he worked. One false move and we were all screwed. We weren't even supposed to be here, and I knew we needed to get out as quickly as we could, but there was even less chance of us explaining the damage to the cabinet if we were caught. I was mopping the floor when I heard the lock open, and Charlie crowed that he still had it as Hadrian approached the cabinet. He went straight for the locket that I'd seen, and when he took something out of his pocket, I was surprised to see a replacement locket dangling from his hand. It wasn't a perfect match, not even close, but as he put it in place with the others, I had to admit that it would lead to some confusion later. He was about to close the cabinet again when his eyes lingered on the totem that sat there too. As he looked, I thought it might be the most emotion I had seen on his face the whole time I'd known him, and it was a dark hunger that made me a little afraid. "Come on," Charlie said. "We got a book." I turned back to see him closing the cabinet, and I couldn't help but notice that the totem was gone. We were heading for the door when I heard an angry yowl from the blotter and thought for sure that we were busted. We all turned to find the big old battered tomcat we all knew as Old One-Ear standing on the desk. His hackles were up, and he looked accusingly at us as if marking our faces. None of us would have admitted it, but I think that cat scared us worse than the warden would have, and we moved off slowly, not feeling right until the door was shut between us and the cat. We were gone about half an hour later, and as we got our uniforms back on and schlepped back to the dorm, I heard the guard's radio inform us that the warden was back on the compound. We all breathed a sigh of relief when we walked back in, prizes in hand, without even being caught. We expected an alarm to raise when the warden discovered that his things were missing, but it never happened. It's been 2 weeks, and there have been no extra searches, no memos have been sent, nothing has been done about it. We thought we had gotten away with it, but then something happened. They found Pete dead, stabbed to death, and pushed into the rec yard bathroom. That had raised an alarm, but they never found the person responsible. We don't know if it was connected to the theft, but I know that all of us have started sticking a lot closer together since then. There are 11 members of the cult left, and we only need one more thing before our goal is within reach. On the full moon, at midnight, we'll go to the cemetery and raise our goddess from the dead. We will stand on her grave and perform the ritual, and we will receive our reward. I looked out over the assembled faces and felt a mix of anticipation and trepidation. The pungent scent of an active sewer made me wrinkle my nose every now and again, and I wasn't sure how they had gotten used to it. How long had they been down here? How long had they been living beneath Tylerville? Above all else, I wondered how they could help me. The man introduced himself as Joseph, and when I asked him where we were going, he said it was something best talked about underground. We were making our way through the city's back alleys, and they seemed to be the real Tylerville. The buildings that didn't fit the aesthetic had been abandoned, and the town had seemed so much larger from the hill than the one I had found. The corpses of old buildings sat dark and abandoned, and when Joseph opened the door to one of them, I was less than surprised to see it was a dry cleaner. Scrub it up, cleanliness is next to brightliness. Huh? Joseph asked, holding the door for me as he let me in. Just something I remember from when I was younger, I said quickly, walking in before I could say something stupid. The old dry cleaner was dark, haunted by the ghosts of old laundry soap and dryer sheets. I heard rats scattering, the gentle scuttle of roaches, and then a much harsher sound. I looked and saw that Joseph was pushing one of the big double-decker washer-dryers out of the way. I went to help him, and once we got it aside, I saw there was a hole behind it. A hole that did not smell altogether inviting. Come on, Joseph said. There's people I want you to meet. We'd gone down, and the deeper we went, the deeper the darkness became. Joseph took out a flashlight, and he must have seen something in my eyes as we went down. He smiled, patting the tunnel lovingly. They're old Prohibition tunnels. Mr. Teeter found them by accident and started using them for storage. They go straight down into the sewers, and the sewers have areas where the work crews leave supplies. That's where we've been staying, living right under their noses. We came to the bottom, and I found a small tent nestled in the lanterns that hung on the walls. They hadn't dared to put generators down here, but it seemed that they had brought lights nonetheless. There weren't a lot of them, maybe 20 people at the most, but as we came down, I had the eye of every one of them. That was how I found myself meeting with what qualified as leadership in this stinking tunnel. Margot was a doctor at the small hospital, and James was a deputy in the old sheriff's department. They both had what the group considered authority, and Joseph had brought me to them before anyone could make too much of a fuss about me being there. I guessed pretty quickly that outsiders weren't exactly welcomed with open arms. At least, not until they were sure that they weren't going to sell them out to the Bright Farm. That was weird to think about, a group I had once equated with Mr. Rogers hunting down dissidents in their sewer, but I supposed a lot of things didn't make a lot of sense these days. Margot and James let me stew in a little room for a while before finally coming to me, Joseph in tow. Joseph looked less than excited about what he had done, and apparently, after a thorough chastising, he was fit to hover on the outskirts of the conversation. Margot kept shooting him less than pleased looks. Her dark hair looked almost crazed as it frizzed around her head. She was still wearing blue scrubs, the kind you usually saw on TV, probably making her a surgeon or something. But she had traded her white coat for something a little more practical. Deputy James, Sheriff James was what most of them called him, even though that wasn't really how it worked, looked like he had just been trying to make it till retirement when all of this had popped off. He had an almost bald head with a fringe of silver around the edges and down his neck. He was still in uniform, but his jacket was tattered and his holster was empty at his hip. "Well, despite Joey's lapse in judgment," Margot said pointedly, "it has come to our attention that you've been asking a lot of dangerous questions around town. Is there some reason why you have a death wish?" "I was just wondering about the church," I said, trying not to let the implications sink in too deep. "I used to watch the show on TV and wanted to—" "Impossible," James said. "They've only been here for a couple of years. There's no way they had a whole TV show already." Margot sniffed. "I told you, James, they're older than that. There's no way they could have organized a takeover like that out of nowhere. They were cohesive, they were guided, and I doubt this is the first time they've done this." She turned to look at me, looking a little less angry now. "This show, did it tell you to come here?" I shook my head, but not very convincingly. "Not when I was a kid, though the town in the show was basically this town. You have all the landmarks here, all the places they went to on the show, and I don't think that's a coincidence." James nodded. "You'd be right about that. Ever since they took over the town, they've been changing it. They abandoned the buildings that didn't fit, they changed the ones that do, and slowly they're taking Tylerville and turning it into something different." "You said they took the town years ago. How have you all been living down here for 2 years?" I asked. "Not very well," James admitted. "There used to be more of us, about 50, and it was cramped down here. The food we had went pretty quick, and we had taken to scavenging in the night. The sewers go to most parts of town, as well as the local farms. We sneak out at night and scavenge sometimes, downright stealing other times, and some of us go out by day to gather information on the farm so we can try to find a weakness or recruit more people. We've tried taking in outsiders before, but they don't usually last. We lost people to the sheriff and his bunch, to the farm. Hell, some of them just leave on raids and never come back. So yeah, not well is the best way to answer your question." "What's your business with the farms?" Margot asked, trying to get the conversation back on track. "Surely you didn't find Tylerville all on your own." This was the portion of the interrogation where I knew I would have to lie, just a little. There was no way in hell I was going to tell these guys that I suspected Miss Mary was my mother. They would probably kill me out of hand just for the association. However, I thought that telling them about Brother Thomas might be a little bit safer. I used to watch the show when I was younger, but my dad told me that I couldn't. I never knew why, but I think now he believed it was dangerous. My grandma told me later that he believed they had taken my mother right after I was born. I found the old TV I used to watch it on. It's in the front seat of my truck. It suddenly came on and spoke to me in the voice of the show's host, Brother Thomas. He told me that if I wanted to find my mother, I should come to Tylerville and look for Bright Farms. I'm guessing that he probably knew I would get trapped by the cops or the residents here, and that was why he told me to come in the first place. They meant to catch me, like they had caught my mom. But if she's alive, then I need to find her. Margot and James looked at each other for a long moment, like an old married couple discussing silently whether the kids could have ice cream this close to dinner. "Kid," James finally said, "if your mom's still alive, then she's not your mom anymore. Once those brat bastards get inside your head, there's no going back. She's theirs now, root and stem, and trying to get in would just be throwing your life away." I tried not to cry, but I could feel the tears leaking down my face as I became frustrated. I have to try. If there's a chance that I can save her, then I have to try. "Sheriff," Joseph said, "what about the—" "No," James said without hesitation. "She's going in there whether we like it or not. If it can help her, she doesn't know what she's talking about, and we certainly aren't going to put a bug in her to root out the devils. It ain't right, Joe, and you know it." I latched on to what they were saying. I'll do it. Whatever it is, I'll do it. If it'll help me get my mom back, I'll do it." James cursed, wiping a hand over his bald head. "You don't even know what you're talking about. You do this, kid, and there might not be any finding your mom. Once this thing gets inside you, it takes over. It wants these bastards as much as we do, but it also wants to eat us along the way. It'll chew through anything that can get its teeth into. That includes people who are trying to help it. There might not be any coming back from this, and all we've managed to do so far is contain it. If we turn it loose, then it could be the end of everything." I looked up and could swear I heard the tears sizzling on my cheeks. "I'll do it. No matter what the cost, I'll do it." He looked at Joseph, his sigh coming out almost bitter. "Damn you, Joe. You just couldn't keep your mouth shut, could you?" Joseph stood a little taller, and he used the extra few inches to make himself look imposing. If it can help, then why wouldn't we let her use it? James looked at Margot, but she just shrugged. "As long as she takes it with her when she goes. I never liked having it here. It's creepy." James threw his hands up in defeat, but rounded on Joseph as he poked him in the chest. "Fine, but you can go with her and make sure it doesn't eat her up halfway there." Joseph nodded. "That's fair. It was my suggestion, after all." "Come on," James said. "If you're taking it, then let's get this shit show on the road." We left the little room and walked through the tent camp. I could see the sad collection of people, all looking like moles as they hunkered beneath the earth. They were utterly dejected, looking defeated already, and even then I saw the furtive glances towards where we were going. James was sorting keys off a ring, and Margot made some excuses to go back to camp before we came to a door at the back of the sewer. "We used to lock the supplies back here when I worked for the city. The cops had some gear down here, the maintenance guys had more supplies, but I think the city planners had some stuff down here too. The tunnel isn't a very closely guarded secret, and it only goes to show how much brain rot comes with the brat. Anyway, this is where we keep it, behind a door, so it can't hurt anybody else." Unlike the rest of the sewer, lit by lamps or small lights, this place shone like the sun. There was a generator back there, powering 3 large floodlights that were all pointed at a chair in the corner. The occupant of that chair was in a straitjacket that had been zip-tied to the chair. He was grotesquely fat, his flesh pushing at the coat like an overfilled sausage threatening to burst its casing. His eyes were hooded, like a hawk, and his mouth was covered with a muzzle that looked like it had once belonged to a large breed of dog. The lights put him in a constant spotlight, and he seemed almost pinned by them. He didn't struggle against the straps, and if they bothered him, you'd never know it. From behind the mask, His mouth was in a constant rictus of a smile. I took a step back, not quite sure what to make of this, and as James took a step into the room, the creature moved its head and smiled in his direction. "What the hell is that?" I asked. "What are you doing to him?" "Not a him," James said, checking something behind before taking out his pocket knife and cutting one of the zip ties. "It stopped being a person on the night we took to the sewers. It used to be the theater teacher at the high school, a man named Corbin Hoff. Something got a hold of him, something the brat doesn't like. He infected a few other people before we could restrain him. I think they're still running around in the woods somewhere, grinning like fools." Before he cut the last of the zip ties, he wrapped a chain around the man's neck and hooked it with a padlock. The creature strained at the chain, but the only sound it made was a low, maddening chuckle. It was the laughter you sometimes heard coming from an insane asylum. It was the laughter that bubbled up from hell. James leaned down, telling the creature exactly what he expected of him. "Listen to me, you son of a bitch. I don't know how much of Corbin is left in there, but I want you to take this girl to the farm. I know you know where it is. I know you want to go there as much as she does. So you take her there. Then," he tossed me the keys to the lock and looked up at me, "you can decide if you want to release him or not. If he served his purpose, cut him loose. If he hasn't, tie the bastard to a tree for all I care and let him rot." The laughter scuttled out again, and I had to hold back a shudder as it walked across my spine like mouse feet. He had said it to me, but he handed the end of the chain to Joseph, who looked less than pleased at the prospect of holding the thing. "I don't understand," I said, trying to hold back tears as the strangeness washed over me. "What is going on?" "This thing'll take you to the Bright Farm, if you still intended to go." Why can't you just tell me where it is?" I said, getting frustrated. "'Cause we don't know," he almost growled. "We know where it should be, but it's never there when we look. Something's hiding it, and I think this thing can find it. Whatever it is, it hates the farm people as much as we do. It wants to hurt them. We were saving it just in case they found us, but if helping you helps us cause a little chaos, then I guess it's worth the loss. Creepy bastard just laughs all night anyway. It's been making people very uneasy. Just take him and go. And Joseph," he looked up at the kid, "don't come back till she makes it to the farm." All I wanted when I was a kid was to go to summer camp. Every summer, I would beg my parents to send me, but they always said the same thing. It's too expensive, or it's too far away, or we can't afford to drive out there when you get homesick. I know, summer camps have fallen out of popularity these days, but they were just about the coolest thing to a kid in the early 90s. Every show had a summer camp episode. There were movies with summer camps. There were even music videos on MTV about summer camps, for God's sake. I felt like I was missing out on a big part of my childhood experience by not being allowed to go, but every year I was forced to sit at home and wish. So when Mom told me that she had found a summer camp for me when I was 11, I was ecstatic. Camp Moonsong was an all-girls camp about an hour from our house, and the fee for 60 days' stay was surprisingly low. Low enough to make Mom suspicious that it was some sort of front for a sweatshop or something, and she read over the paperwork very carefully with my dad. I remember just hovering outside the kitchen as they went over it, Dad not showing her level of dedication as he held paperwork in one hand and smoked with the other. They talk about not being responsible for injuries or accidents a lot in this stuff, I remember Mom saying, and then sighing when Dad scoffed. "They're just being careful, Wendy. Sounds perfect, honestly. She's been begging to go to one for years. If we don't send her before 13, I think she'll miss her chance. You know, 12's usually the cutoff on these kinds of things." They discussed it for a while, and when they finally came and said I could go, I was overjoyed. I had my bags packed before the last week of school was even out, and on the second day of summer vacation, my mom and dad drove me to the camp for drop-off. It was beautiful, one of those camps like you see on TV. It was in the middle of the woods with a bunch of little cabins next to a lake, and I could see a boathouse, hiking trails, archery courses, and all kinds of things that I was chomping at the bit to go try. We met the head counselor at the main cabin, a smiling blonde lady named Gladys. And after some hugs and some last-minute checks of my stuff, my parents headed out, and I was shown to the Sparrow cabin, where I would be staying for the next 60 days. That is where I met Lauren, Sandy, Heather, and Claire, the girls who would be my cabin mates. Sandy and Heather were 12, and this was their first time at Moonsong, but not at sleepaway camp. Lauren was 10, and she had never been to camp either, so this was a first for both of us. Claire, however, had been coming here for about 3 years, and she was the only one of us who didn't look excited. She was trying to put on a brave face, clearly not wanting to spook us, but her mood was kind of off. Claire was also our cabin captain, so when the loudspeaker came on, welcoming us and telling us to meet at the pavilion for orientation, she led the way. The pavilion turned out to be a small amphitheater, a stone stage with rows of concrete seats leading up and out of it. We took a seat at the section near the stage, all of us chatting animatedly, except for Claire, as the other cabins assembled. Each cabin had 5 girls. There were 6 cabins in all: sparrow, magpie, grouse, dove, hawk, and crow. They had all spread out a little, giving each cabin room to gather, and as we all sat chattering, the camp counselors arrived to start the orientation. "Welcome, welcome, welcome, campers," said Gladys, her voice echoing off the stone benches, "and welcome to another exciting year at Camp Moonsong." There were a few other adults on the stage, and she introduced them as the activity directors. There was a counselor for swimming, canoeing, archery, hiking, nature studies, physical challenges, and arts and crafts. Gladys told us how our daily schedules would be posted on the bulletin board outside of our cabins at first light, and that each day would end with a marshmallow roast at the fire pit. "And don't forget, the fire pit is where we choose that night's sleepwalker," she said, something that brought nothing but polite claps from some of the campers. I saw more than a few of them that looked like Claire when she said it, and I realized there might be something a little strange at work here. Our first activity was archery, so Claire took us back to the cabin to get ready. "So, what's with the sleepwalker thing?" I asked, Heather chiming in as well as Claire went to go get a shirt that was a little more comfy. "It's nothing," she said, stripping out of her polo and slipping on a t-shirt. "It's just something that Camp Moonsong does. It doesn't mean anything. It's just tradition." "What do you mean?" I asked, the 4 of us falling in behind her as we headed for the range. She made a frustrated noise, rounding on us angrily. Just don't worry about it. If you're lucky, it won't be a problem anyway. There's 30 of us. The chances are good that a few of you might never have to see it," she said, the last more to herself than anything. "See what?" I asked, but she ignored me as we came to the archery course. We had archery, arts and crafts, and a trip to the lake that day, and by the time the sun set and the bonfire sprang to life, I found I'd quite forgotten about the sleepwalker. We spent a while roasting and eating marshmallows, singing songs, telling spooky stories, and then I saw Gladys step close to the fire with a box that rattled a little. Some of the girls looked at it ominously, Claire among them, but Gladys was all smiles. "Okay, campers, it's time to pick tonight's sleepwalker. You returning campers know how it works. If you reach into the box and draw out the black ball, you're tonight's sleepwalker." I snorted, not quite sure why this had some of them so worried. What, were they gonna come and scare us in our cabin if one of us drew the black ball? Would we have to scare people? What was this, I wondered, because it all seemed kind of ridiculous. The box had barely gone through 5 people when a girl of about 8 got the black ball. It was clearly her first time here because she seemed pleased but mystified as she handed Gladys back the ball. Gladys asked what her name was and then announced that Brenda was the summer's first sleepwalker. After that, we all went back to our cabins, even Brenda, and I remember sitting up a little with the other girls and whispering about how silly it all was. Were they trying to scare us or something? Ooh, sleepwalkers, we all said as we laughed, but when Claire told us to go to sleep, she said something that took the starch out of our sheets. Wait till tomorrow morning, then we'll see if you still think it's funny. She was right. The bugle woke us up the next morning, and we all shuffled to breakfast in the mess hall. Amidst the chomps of cereal, toast, eggs, and bacon, I heard someone sniffling loudly. It wasn't normal sniffling, like the kind you get from someone being homesick. This was different, and I didn't have words for it yet. I do now that I've grown up a little. It's the hopeless kind of sniffling from someone who's lost something they can't get back, like a mother or a wife crying for a husband or a child. I glanced over at the crow table and saw that it was Brenda. She looked terrible, like she hadn't slept at all, and the circles under her eyes looked more like bruises. She wasn't eating, despite how the girls in her cabin tried to coax her, and her eyes seemed to weep constantly. The crow table was next to ours, and she seemed to be telling them in between sobs that she wanted to go home. They were trying to talk her out of it, saying that the chances were low that she would draw it again, and after a few days, she would forget all that she had seen. I didn't exactly know what to make of them, but I would learn. For the next week and a half, I watched as different girls drew the black ball. The ones who had been here before took it better than the new ones, and the new ones were always in tears the next day. Because of how the schedules were set up, we really didn't have a lot of interaction with the other cabins. We lived with the girls in our cabin, but outside of meals and the fire pit, we didn't see the others during the day. Most of them stuck pretty close to their groups during the periods in between activities, and none of them wanted to talk about what was going on if you asked them. Then, about a week and a half after Brenda drew the ball, Heather drew out the jet black sphere and was that night's sleepwalker. I remember the look on her face when she drew it out, the look of uncertainty and fear, and Gladys named her the sleepwalker of the night. She went back to the sparrow cabin, seeming unsure of what to expect, and as we got ready for bed, we all watched her a little apprehensively. "So," Heather asked, "what happens now? Do I start walking or something? Do they come and get me in the night?" "Maybe they're going to make you disappear," Lauren said, and we all laughed nervously. "Just go to sleep," Claire said, and it shut us all up as we looked at her. "It won't happen till then." She slid under her blankets and slid a pillow over her head. So we all settled in, turning the lamp off and nestling down for sleep. Heather was soon snoring, as was Lauren, and I yawned as I drifted off as well. I guessed if something was going to happen, then it would happen. Before I knew it, I was dreaming about swimming and friendship bracelets and all the other things I was going to do tomorrow. I woke up in the middle of the night, filled with a need to pee worse than anything I'd ever felt. I was coming back from the latrines, almost back in bed, when I glanced at Heather and saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Heather's mouth was open in a silent "oh" of a scream. Her hands were bunched up in the covers, and she was writhing slowly on the sheets of her small bed. Her eyes were closed, shut tight like they might be locked that way, and she sucked in breath like she might be screaming in whatever dream she was having. I woke the others, showing them what was happening, and when Sandy reached out to shake her, Claire grabbed her by the wrist. "It won't do any good, and it could make it worse. You just have to let her get over it on her own." "But we can't just leave her like this. She's in pain," Sandy said. "She could be in more pain if you wake her up. She'll come out of this at dawn, so just let her be." We went back to bed, none of us but Claire sleeping, and when the sun came up, Heather came awake, shaking like someone who's been startled badly. She looked around like something might be after her, like this might all be a dream too, and when we came to comfort her, she began to sob. Her eyes had the same dark circles that I'd seen on the other girls, and she walked to chow when the bugle sounded like a zombie. She didn't eat breakfast, and when I asked her what she dreamed about, Claire shot me a nasty look. We don't talk about it. The worst thing you can do is to make her relive it. But if we know what happens when you're the sleepwalker, if you're lucky, Claire said, talking over me as my voice rose, you'll never have to find out. No, Heather said suddenly. No, I want to talk about it. Claire got a pained look. You don't have to. I know what it's like. It's not something you should have to relive. Wait, I said, putting something together that I should have a while ago. You knew this was going to happen, and you didn't warn us. Why didn't you say something? Because it wouldn't have done any good, Claire said. Knowing it's coming doesn't make it any easier. It's terrible, no matter if it's the first time or the fifth. I got chosen twice last year. The knowing doesn't matter. It's terrible, every time. Do you want to know or not? Heather said, turning to us angrily. Because I'm only going to tell it once, and then I never want to talk about it again. We said we did, and she got a faraway look as she began. I was in the woods. It was night, and everything was dark. Then I felt something watching me, something like a tiger or a bear or something. It was big, whatever it was, because when it roared, it shook all the trees around me. I started running through the woods as fast as I could. You say I was in bed, but my legs ache and my arms feel the pine needles that slashed at them. I ran and ran and ran, but it never seemed to catch me. It was always just out of sight, just out of reach. And the farther I ran, the more afraid I got. After a while, I felt like I was going crazy. I was so scared, so absolutely terrified, and it just never ended. Then, just as the sun came up, I heard it roar, and I heard the trees rustle as it jumped, and I fell down as something heavy hit me. Then I woke up, and you guys were standing there looking at me. She started crying then, and Claire gave her a hug as she assured her that it was over. She was safe now. Needless to say, Heather decided to stay in when we saw it was our turn to hike today. She'd spent a whole night in the woods and saw no reason to spend another hour looking at nature. That's how it went that summer. Every night we drew the balls from the box, and every night it was some girl's turn to spend it in a state of terror. Sandy got her turn, Laura too. Even Claire had to suffer it one night. But never me. Some of the girls went twice, but I seemed to be immune to the black ball. It never chose me. If it hadn't been for the team challenge, I would never have experienced it. Team challenge was Gladys's idea, and she was clearly proud of it. It was the last week of camp, and I'd almost thought I would get away without having to be the sleepwalker. We were gathered for the morning meeting after breakfast, and all of us assembled in the amphitheater. Gladys stood up there, smiling like she had a big surprise for us. And I suppose she was right. Good morning, campers. This week I have something special planned. Today we start the team challenges. 2 cabins will face each other in 3 events: archery, canoe races, and obstacle course. The winner will be immune to sleepwalking for that night. The losing cabin, however, will all have to be the sleepwalkers that night. No one cheered, but we all knew the stakes. The way it shook out was for 3 days the cabins would compete. On the 4th day, one of them would get the bye, and the other 2 would face off. On the 5th day, the last 2 would go head-to-head for the crown of best cabin. Saturday would be color war, and then pickup. Claire took us aside and told us we had to win this. Everyone in the cabin's been the sleepwalker at least once. Well, almost all of us, she said, looking at me jealously. I didn't feel good about it. Quite the contrary, I felt terrible. Heather had been the sleepwalker twice, Sandy too, and I hadn't been picked once. I didn't want to either. I'd watched them go through it, and it looked miserable. As it happens, though, I had one of the best times on the obstacle course, and I was one of the better campers on the archery range. I felt we had a good chance of winning this thing, and the girls agreed as we started making a game plan. The Sparrows beat the Crows on Tuesday, and when we got the bye on Thursday, we were hopeful that we could win this thing, and the incentive was on full display. The losing team showed up to breakfast with bags under their eyes, shaking noticeably as they refused to eat. Whatever was going on, it was even worse in a group, and we were prepared to win against the Hawks and take the whole contest. We had them at archery, but they smoked us at the canoe race. We were certain that we could whip them at the obstacle course, but that's when disaster struck. As Claire came across the final leg of the course, having gone last so I could go first and give us a strong start, she slipped and fell off the beam, the race going to our opponents. The Hawks won, and we would be the sleepwalkers that night. We fought it, trying to stay up as late as we could, trying to stay up all night, but we were just so tired. By 11, we were all dozing. By midnight, we lost the fight. I remember blinking owlishly as I watched Claire drifting off fitfully. When I opened my eyes, I was in the forest. We were all in the forest, looking around as we awoke into some kind of strange shared dream. I was just trying to orient myself when I heard the roar that Heather had described, and it galvanized me in a way that nothing ever had. It was like a bear's roar mixed with something feline and something much deeper. I imagined it was a Tyrannosaurus Rex, the scream of some extinct creature come back to life, and I started running. They were with me in the beginning, all of us neck and neck as we fled into the woods. It was always behind us, stomping through the trees like it was as tall as a redwood. It crashed, it rumbled, and as we ran for our lives, it menaced us from the darkness. Heather was the first to fall. I looked back, meaning to help her, but the darkness swirled up and took her. Her tear-streaked, terrified face was there one moment, and suddenly she was swallowed up by the gloom. Laura fell next, stumbling as she looked back at Heather, and I didn't look back to see what gobbled her up. I kept running, kept showing my heels, and when Sandy fell too, I didn't even notice right away. I was in a state of panic, something I would later call a heightened terror response when I went to college to study psychology. It was similar to the response prey animals have when they're fleeing for their lives, a kind of thing that gets them eaten by pack hunters when another one pops up on the side while they're focused on the threat behind them. I ran and ran and ran, my legs pumping and my heart racing. I didn't know when Claire fell, or even if she did, but I felt the branches that reached out to slow me down and the rocks that battered my bare feet. I felt every mile that I ran, and I felt every horrifying stumble as I nearly lost my balance. I kept running for my life, and when the sun came up at long last, I didn't stop. I heard it spring, heard it come up from behind me like a tidal wave, but if it hit me, I didn't know about it. I came awake like I meant to fight off an attacker, and the other girls were around me, looking as bad, if not worse. We lost the color war. All of us were too tired to focus. Mom commented on the bruises under my eyes when she came to pick me up, but I just hugged her and said how glad I was to see her. I never spoke about that summer, not until I wrote my senior thesis on the difference between irrational and rational fear in adolescence. I didn't think I would ever visit those memories again, not till today. I've been working as a psychiatrist since I graduated, helping kids get over their trauma and trying to find them some relief. Most of it's normal stuff, divorcing parents or concerned about their school friends. We talk about monsters in closets or stories that won't go away when they close their eyes. Typical little kid stuff, but sometimes I help them tell parents about someone who's doing something they shouldn't, so that person can go somewhere where they can't hurt them again. Those are the good days, the days I feel like I've made a difference. When the girl started telling me about the dreams, the ones she had after her mother said they had enrolled her in camp again, I felt myself beginning to hyperventilate. She described dreams of something big chasing her through the woods at night, about dreams that only come when she was at camp, and only when she was the sleepwalker. I didn't even feel it at first when the pen snapped in my hand, and when the girl said, her voice panicked, that I was bleeding, I looked down to see that my hand had the jagged end of a pen buried in it. I told her mother that she might want to find another summer camp this year, not voicing what I actually believed so I didn't sound crazy. The mother seemed concerned. "But Jenny loves Camp Moonsong. She's gone every year since she was 9. I strongly recommended that she find her daughter another camp, and the two left mollified with a prescription refill. I had never imagined the place was still open, never in my wildest dreams. I sat in my office, trying to control the shakes as my hand throbbed like an infected tooth. I'm afraid to go to sleep tonight, something I haven't been afraid of since that first week of camp. I'm afraid I might wake up in the woods again, fleeing the thing that chases the sleepwalkers. Okay, Doug. Why don't you tell me what you can remember? Doug was lying on her new couch, something Winter had bought in Atlanta from one of those high-end boutiques that she and Maggie like to visit sometimes. The lady in the blue polo had told her it was made of memory foam and microfibers, some kind of super fabric that would optimize comfort for those who took a seat on it. Despite the fancy couch, her patient looked distinctly uncomfortable, and Pamela knew why. Poor Doug was one of those residents, the broken ones that Winter had gathered to herself so she could help them. In a box of broken toys, Doug was more broken than most. "Comfy," Doug said, wiggling a little as the memory foam cradled him. "I could use one of these at home. I might sleep longer than an hour a night. Maybe if I slept a little, Tina wouldn't talk so much." He had brought the battered old radio with him, an object that Winter had been assured did not work, but that hardly mattered. Doug would have heard voices even if the radio had worked, had ever since the incident, and likely would until he joined his friends on the other side. No, Winter reminded herself, Doug did not hear voices. Doug heard one specific voice, and it was a voice that tormented him endlessly. "Now, Doug, I want you to go back to that day. Can you do that?" "I'll try," he said, yawning as he closed his eyes and attempted to get into position for treatment. He had drunk his tea about half an hour ago, and it should have taken effect by now. Winter had never met anyone immune to the tea, but it didn't affect everyone the same. Perhaps, she thought, Doug had been subjected to this one too many times, and it wasn't having the same impact. She hoped not, because Doug was also one of the most difficult of her citizens to manipulate the old-fashioned way, if it came down to it. Something about whatever the cult had done to him made him extremely hard to get into, and that made his recovery all the more difficult. Sometimes, Winter wondered about that, though. Was it the cult that had done it? Or whatever was inside him that had done it? What Doug had was no normal memory, and Winter meant to have it, for Doug's sake, if not the sake of her own curiosity. "Are you feeling relaxed?" Winter asked. "A little," he said. It's hard to get comfortable. It's hard to get out of the headspace. The headspace was what the cult had called the ascension mindset. When you were in the headspace, you could receive messages from the Supreme Leader. When you were in the headspace, you could ascend and meet the extraterrestrials on the other side. Headspace, however, was also what Doug called it when he remembered being in the cult. "All right, Doug, I need you to go back to the day of the incident. Can you do that?" "I'll try," Doug said again, getting comfortable as his eyes slipped shut. Finally, Doug slipped into the headspace, let his body go rigid, and entered the state he needed so she could work on him. Winter gave a sigh of relief. She'd have to get it this time, because she wasn't sure that he would go under like this again. "What do you see, Doug?" she asked, and Doug began. "I've traveled back to August 12th, 2005. For most people, it was a day like any other. Just another day of going to work, bitching about traffic, picking up dinner, watching TV with family before bed. August 12th, 2005 was the day Doug almost ascended to the stars, the day he almost died. I remember how the jumpsuit made my shoulder itch. The Supreme Leader wanted us all to wear those silver jumpsuits, spacesuits, he called them, and these special boots that came up to our knees. He said we were going to be space explorers, that we were going to travel the galaxy and find new life. But what I remember was the itch that suit made me feel on my shoulder. I think I might have been allergic to the material, because Tina had always put lotion on my shoulders after our practice runs. Tina. I remember her face, her short, red hair, her cute little upturned nose that wrinkled when she smiled, the scar going through her top lip where her father had slashed her when she was little. I remember her smile most of all. I remember wishing my mother had smiled at me like that, and that Tina would make such a wonderful mother one day. I remember the way she smiled as she held up her cup. There was a lot of noise around us. The National Guard was at the gates, and Brother Sebastian was trying to buy us some time. All across the compound, people were going to meet the passing starship, and in the upper rooms, Tina and I were preparing to disembark. "See ya, spaceman," she said, as we linked arms and took our cocktails. I don't know what was in it, but it was supposed to make it easier for us to ascend. If it didn't, then the helmets would help with the transition. The helmets crinkled as we slid them over our heads. She was smiling as she pulled it down tight. But then something went wrong. I pulled mine down tight too. I was supposed to, but as I lost the strength in my arms, I saw her lean up ever so slightly. Her hand shook as she brought a single finger over my mouth and punctured my helmet. The helmets, they were plastic bags, but that's what the Supreme Leader called them. Had to be tight, or else you wouldn't ascend. As I lay there, blacking out under the effects of the cocktails, my final thought was that I wouldn't ascend, and I'd be left behind. I didn't wake up on a spaceship like we were supposed to. I woke up in the ER, the only survivor of the Stargazer Society. Of the 45 members, 43 had ascended. The Supreme Leader had left after the last one had stopped moving, taking everything and running away to Mexico. I was the only one who didn't die in that house. I was the only one to be left behind. The leader doesn't count. He never believed in the vision, but we did. We all believed. And now I'm left here to suffer. Winter watched him as he lay there, the eyes behind his lids undoubtedly staring into the void. "That's not what brought you here, though, is it, Doug?" She was sitting on the coffee table across from him, waiting for just the right moment to strike. She'd have to be quick, or she'd miss it, and there might not be a next time. No, it's because Tina spoke to me. Tina told me she was sorry for what she had done." "What did she say to you, Doug? Tell me. Get it all out." Doug's eyes moved like trapped goldfish beneath his lids, his mind going to the moment when he had heard her. "I've heard her a few times, but it's never when anyone else is around. It makes me feel like I'm going crazy." "You aren't going crazy, Doug," she assured him, though what she wanted to add was, "not yet. Tell me about the first time. Tell me about what happened the first time she spoke to you." Doug's eyes kept moving, his teeth beginning to chatter, as Winter watched something push deep inside him. "I was washing dishes, listening to that old radio, when I heard her. The radio was something she had given me when we were in the cult. We weren't supposed to listen to music. It wasn't part of our ascension mindset. But we both loved this program that came on late at night, a rock program with a disc jockey who loved to play old rock, the kind we grew up with, and sometimes we would listen to it in secret after everyone went to bed. It was the only thing I took with me from the house when I left. I made the paramedics grab it as they wheeled me out, thrashing and yelling until they did it to shut me up, and I've had it ever since. It reminds me of Tina. Maybe that's why she... Winter was losing whatever it was, the memory or the fear or whatever, and she told him to focus on the moment. She knew about the radio. He had been carrying it when she'd found him. Doug had been wandering the streets of San Diego, the radio pressed to his ear as he spoke to someone that only he could hear. He had been scared of Winter when she first approached him, saying Tina was frightened of her too, but Winter had soothed him and helped him find something better. Over the years, she had tried to assure Doug that he didn't need the radio, that it was broken, and it was hurting him, but he refused to let it go. It was how Tina spoke to him, and Winter hoped that this would be the last time Tina spoke to him. Tina only ever told him to do one thing, and if Winter hadn't found him, Doug would likely not be here today. Right, Doug said, gagging a little as it came bulging up his throat. "One minute I was listening to Nirvana, then Tina was there, talking through the radio. She told me that she was sorry. She told me that she shouldn't have stopped me. She was happy where she was. She was with the others. She wanted me to come with her. She wanted me to come to the spaceship with her. She wanted us to..." But he made a strangled sound as it came slithering up his throat. Winter had seen it several times before, but this was the most she had ever gotten out. They usually appeared as balls, like fruit, but some of them could be quite capricious. This one looked like nothing so much as a multicolored snake, its tip whipping about frantically as it made to slide back into the safety of Doug's innards. Winter caught hold of its slippery body, her hands sliding over the slimy creature as she took hold. It writhed against her, trying to escape, but she drug it out. It was huge, the longest she had ever seen, and as it came free, Doug began to cough and buck. She bashed the thing's head against the desk a few times as it squirmed, and after a few hard knocks it stopped moving. Winter had a pickle jar ready for it, and as it went inside, she heard a very small voice wafting from the mouth of the big container. "I shouldn't have stopped you. Come join me in the stars." She secured the lid and put it in the closet with the others. Dropping into her chair with a deep sigh, Doug lay back, his eyes no longer pulsing, as his breath became something close to normal. In reality, Winter thought there never had been a Tina. She had checked the roster for the Stargazer Society 100 times, and no one by that name had ever been found when the cult had taken its own life. What's more, all reports say that Doug had been found by himself in the attic. He had been lying beside the radio that he now clung to like a security blanket, and he had been the only survivor. Whether Tina was a delusion or something more sinister, Winter didn't know. Whatever she had been, she was gone now, and Doug could go back to a normal life. He got up 30 minutes later, looking around and asking how the session had gone. When he left the radio behind. "It doesn't work. I don't know why I haven't thrown it out sooner," he said, smiling at her as if embarrassed. Winter told him that she'd get rid of it for him, but left it on the corner of her desk as she filled out the paperwork. She didn't know if it was a memory or something else, but she wanted to study it. Who knew? Maybe Doug had encountered something beyond their understanding. Perhaps, as he stargazed, the stars had gazed back and decided to observe him a little more closely. She was filling out his chart when the radio crackled, a female voice loosing a rising scream that made the speakers rattle. "Give it back! Give it back! It isn't yours! It belongs to—" But it was cut off as Winter reached over and turned the dial. Very strange, she thought. Maybe Doug had been hearing something this whole time. Just another mystery in a town full of mysteries. Hey guys, it's your favorite park ranger again. Some of you have asked how I got started being a park ranger. It's actually a pretty interesting story, one that really started my journey with the Park Service and sets the tone for the rest of my career. So after graduating high school, I started trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. I thought about college, but ultimately dismissed the idea. I was a solid B student, and the thought of going back to school seemed terrible. I'd been volunteering as an assistant scoutmaster, working part-time at the community pool, and started thinking it might be nice to be doing something in the woods. I'd never considered the park services, but when I found a flyer on a bulletin board while I was taking some of the kiddos on a hike, I thought I might have found something to try out. Wanted, fire watchtower operator, high school diploma, reference is a must, outdoor skills a plus, ability to stay in the woods for 90 days an absolute must. $4,800 at the end of 90 days with the potential to re-enroll with good service. Contact Ranger Station A for inquiries. I did a little more than call the station. Once I had concluded the hike and the kids were back in their minivans and compact cars with their parents, I went to Station A to inquire in person. There were a couple of bored-looking rangers sitting around, but after some questions and some finger-pointing, I was directed to Ranger Thurman, someone who would eventually be my boss. He shook my hand, taking in my scoutmaster garb, and asked about my credentials. I explained that I was an assistant scoutmaster, a lifeguard, an avid hiker, and an amateur rock climber, and that I was looking for something to give me a chance to think about my next step in life. Thurman had laughed. "Well, 3 months is a long time to think, kiddo. You sure you're up for it? It drives some of them stir-crazy. They end up naked in the woods by the time we find them." I told him I thought I could handle it, and he took my application and said he'd get back to me. A week later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize, and it turned out to be him. "So it's been a slow season for sign-ups, but not a slow season for fires. The head ranger has actually opened up 3 decommissioned towers this season, so the need for help is at an all-time high. If you think you can handle yourself, I'm willing to give you a shot." Told him I'd be happy for the opportunity, and he told me to come to the station on Monday for orientation. Orientation was lengthy, but mostly shook out to staying alert, not getting distracted, and spending most of your time in the tower. You would be keeping watch in one of the 7 fire towers, the big metal structures that sat about 80 feet off the ground. Once a week, there would be a delivery of provisions. Nothing fancy, but very sustainable. The tower had power, thanks to a generator near the base, and gas for the week would be part of that weekly delivery. Other than that, we were free to do whatever we liked, as long as we were keeping watch. Speaking of keeping watch, I had my eye on a blonde in the 3rd row for most of the presentation. She looked like someone who laid out a lot, her skin tanned and her hair pulled back into a tail. I wondered what tower she was going to be in, and whether I might strike up a friendship with her while we were assigned here. Don't hold it against me. I was young, and most of my brain was earmarked for one thing and one thing only. I wanted to speak with her after the orientation had ended, but she rushed off and I never got the chance. I figured I'd get another chance when they sent us our assigned towers, but no such luck. A week later, I got orders to report to the Fringe Trail, Route A, and Thurman was waiting for me with a pack of gear and some final instructions. "There's a radio in there. Keep it going. If you run into any trouble, call the station immediately. We don't usually hire kids who aren't past 25, but we're short, and I'll be honest, I got a good feeling about you. If you make it through the 90 days, I might have something more permanent, if you're interested. You've got the skill set I usually look for when hiring rangers for my team." I told him I'd think about it, but right then I was only interested in getting to the tower and getting set up. "Tower's at the end of the trail. You can't miss it. It's about 2 miles in, so I hope you packed light." I had, and I came to the tower at about 3 o'clock after a pretty easy hike through the park. I'd seen the fire towers from a distance, and I knew that most of them were on the edges of the park, so they could see the more remote areas on the fringes of the recreation area. The fire watch was less for camping areas or swimming holes, and more for the scrublands and the untraveled areas. We were watching for lightning strikes, stray cigarettes from inexperienced hikers, and people who think they're ready for more rigorous camping, but are less prepared than they think. I found the tower easily enough, and to my surprise, it had a ramp leading up to it, as opposed to a ladder. After 2.5 hours on the trail, it was a nice surprise. The observation deck wasn't anything fancy, but I hadn't expected it to be. A single bed, a kitchenette, some paperback books on a shelf, a lot of glass that overlooked the woods. There looked to be a river nearby, a little gorge off to the left, a lot of green trees waving hello. All in all, wasn't a bad view for a few months, and I was looking forward to seeing what lay within the depths of those woods. It was getting dark, so I settled in, watching the sun sink below the horizon, when the radio crackled and I heard Ranger Thurman call for a check-in. "Tower 3, checking in," I said when my turn came, and as I set the radio down, I tuned out the rest of them. 1 day down, 89 to go, I thought. I turned the switch on for the lights and went to check out the paperbacks on the shelf as I looked for something to do. I had my phone, but the reception here was spotty at best. There was no Wi-Fi out here, not like I'd expected there to be, and as I found a Dean Koontz novel I hadn't read before, I heard the radio crackle as someone called someone else by name, clearly looking for some company. I tuned it out and kept reading, but after a while, I heard other people inviting people to go to different channels on the radio. It appeared that a few of them were attempting to start a party line, which was just as well because the book I'd picked was kind of dull. I twisted through the channels, listening to the chatter from the other 7 towers, but I didn't really feel moved to chime in on any of the conversation. They were talking about sports or video games or movies, and most of them weren't talking about anything I really had an interest in. I twisted off Channel 4 when I heard the subject matter, and I couldn't believe that 2 of them were doing that right out in the open on an open channel. They had known each other for a couple of hours, tops. Get a room, for God's sakes. That's how I landed on Channel 7 and heard an unsure voice that would be my company for the next few months. "Hello? Anyone there?" "Tower 3's here. Who's this?" "Gretchen, from Tower 13. I'm glad somebody found me here. I felt like I was getting lost in the chatter of the other towers." Tower 13 wasn't one I was familiar with. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was someone playing a game, and I was hopeful that it was the cute girl from orientation. I didn't know what tower she had been sent to, but I was confident that she had a radio too. "Well, Gretchen from Tower 13, how did you find the conversation on the other channels?" "Pretty dull, honestly. They chattered about sports or movies or whatever. It's the same every year, to be fair. They just talk about boring things and spend the next 3 months ignoring all the natural beauty around them." I leaned back in my bunk, deciding I liked her even more. "And how do you like the beauty of nature?" "I like it a lot. There's a warren of rabbits within easy view of my tower, and I love watching them come out when they feel safe. They nibble and hop around. It's pretty adorable. There's a nest not too far from the warren of some hawks that seem to come back every year to nest. I know the one this year is the same because he's got the same tail stripe like the little one from last year." I'd have to break out my binoculars and have a look around when the sun came up. I would love to spend my days watching the deer or the birds who made the area their home. Gretchen was starting to sound more and more like my kind of girl, and as we talked about nature and hiking and whatnot, I watched the night slip by until I realized it was almost 2 a.m. "Hey, I better get some sleep," I told her. "Don't want to sleep through any potential fires tomorrow." "Oh, I didn't realize it was so late. Well, when you want to talk, hop on Channel 7. Someone seems to have left a radio here, so I find myself with 2. I'll keep one on the main channel and one on 7, just for you." I smiled, wishing her good night, and swapped back to Channel 1. It seemed I had made a friend, and it was a friend who would fill my evenings with conversation for the next few months. The next couple of weeks seemed to fly by. I spent my days hiking to various things, checking on hikers that Dispatch had sent me out after, going to reported fires in the area. It was a dry summer, so fires in the park were strictly prohibited, and even once to check on a drunk that someone had reported wandering near my tower. Mostly, however, I sat in my tower and watched for fires. It was a big year for fires too, but not that early in the season. This was June, and we all knew that the need to watch wouldn't really be dire until July. That was when attendance would be at its highest, and we'd need to keep our eyes peeled for smoke day and night. "Those are always the worst weeks," Gretchen confided. "I've seen more fire and rescue come in July than any other month. Last year, a family accidentally set their tent on fire by not putting out their campfire and burned up a big section of the woods in the process. They all died, which was sad, but they should have been more careful." We talked a lot more about fires that night, and I remember it being the end of June because I thought it was our 3-week anniversary. Silly, I know, since we weren't even dating, but I felt like she wouldn't have minded. I hadn't really done much besides a little bit of chatter with the other towers, and it was rare for me to swap my radio over to Channel 1 again before about 2 a.m. after final check-in. I spent most of my evenings with Gretchen, and I felt like she was as glad for the company as I was. "Hey, what do you do when you aren't in a fire tower?" I asked on a whim. There was silence for a moment before Gretchen finally got back to me. "I don't know, not much I suppose. Usually just come back for another season." "Well, would you want to do something after the season is over?" I asked, holding my breath as I waited for her response. You're sweet, but I just don't think we'd work out like that." I felt a little disappointed, but I understood. "I get it. You're probably married or something out in the real world. I get it." "Oh, no, it's nothing like that. It's just, this is kind of my life. I come back season after season because I love this place. The tower is more of a home to me than the one I came from, and I can't imagine anywhere but here." And that's fair, but maybe we could at least go get a coffee or something and see how things go. She laughed. "I'd like that." It was the second week of July when the big fire happened that would lead me to meet Gretchen and understand why things wouldn't work between us. The official report said that it was started by an improperly extinguished campfire. Some coals had been burning under the dirt the campers had thrown on it, and it had caught and spread to a nearby field of very dry, tall grass. The woods went up quickly, the rain having been sparse since May, The fire was in a part of the park that wasn't really attended, mostly scrublands and little valleys, so that was good for evacuation. The bad news was that it was about 3 miles from my tower, and I was asleep when it got big enough for another tower to see and report it. By the time they reported it, however, I was out of the tower and running for my life. I had signed off at about 1:30, telling Gretchen I'd talk to her tomorrow, and when her less than melodic voice broke into my dreams about an hour later, I came up groggily from sleep. I was convinced I was still dreaming. I could smell smoke, I could hear the sounds of frantic animals as they fled, and I picked up my radio to see how she had gotten in touch with me and what the problem was. I stood up, asking her what was wrong, when I saw the fire coming closer and closer to my tower. I started to turn back to Channel 1, apparently having passed out with the radio on Channel 7, but Gretchen came back on to tell me that it was already reported. If you don't leave right now, you won't get a chance. The fire is spreading quicker than normal, and it's going to cut you off if you aren't careful. Get your boots on and go. I threw my boots on, grabbed my hiking pack, and barely remembered to grab the radio before I ran out into the night. I swapped to 1 and tried to call it in, but the fire must have knocked something out because none of the channels gave me anything but harsh static. I turned back to 7 and started heading away from the fire, making my way up a stream pretty close to the tower. If I could get into the stream, I might be safe, but if it boxed me in, then it could also be stuck there, with nowhere to go. Cut north, the radio said, and I almost dropped it. I'd forgotten I'd brought it with me, and as I fumbled my compass out and gained my bearings, I headed north. I couldn't understand why fire and rescue wasn't already on the scene. The fire was big enough to be seen by more than just my tower, but I put it out of my mind as I headed towards the river. "A little more east," Gretchen said. "Not too much. There you go. Keep heading that way and you'll miss the fire." I could see it coming up my right side, the heat baking off it enough to make me squint. I hadn't realized that it was that dry out here, but I was quickly being hemmed in by the fire. I needed a way out, but I didn't know if I could make it before I was trapped. "Go east through the creek and look for the tower. Once you make it there, you should be safe." "Which tower?" I asked, coughing as the smoke hit my throat. "It's mine. It's 13. Just make it here. It should be outside the fire line." I kept running, coughing as I tried to get away from the spreading heat. Gretchen helped me, telling me which way to go. When I stumbled into the dry creek, she told me to get up and run, or I'd get stuck in there. The flames were coming on strong, eating up the dry ground like a hungry beast, and I scrambled out of the dry bed and saw the top of a tower against the purple sky. It was dark, but maybe that made it easier for her to see me. It wasn't until I came to the base of the tower that I had my doubts. The tower was old, rickety even, and looked like this wasn't the first fire it had seen. It sat in a clump of new trees, the ground around it scraggy and disturbed, and I couldn't see a thing up top. On the side, the numbers nearly unintelligible, was a faded 13. "Are you in there?" I asked, hesitating before just climbing this death trap to see someone I was beginning to doubt was there. "Yeah, come on up." Something moved then. Something slithered behind the windows, and suddenly I thought I might have been safer with the fire. It was nothing substantial, just a quick trailing of mist, but it was something, and it filled me with an insatiable dread. I should not be here, my mind yelled. I should be somewhere else, somewhere safe, somewhere with people. And as I took a step away, I heard Gretchen again come from the radio. "What's wrong? Getting cold feet?" I didn't answer. I took a step away, but as I did, something stepped out onto the observation deck of the tower. It was too dark to see, its body made of midnight, but I could see eyes looking down at me, and they looked anything but friendly. "Come up," called Gretchen, her voice coming from the whatever it was, like a recording. "Come up. I can't wait to see you." Just then, a spotlight hit me, and the thing screeched like it had been shot. "Don't move," said a loudspeaker from the helicopter overhead. "We'll drop a ladder for you." I took one more look at the tower, but whatever it had been wasn't there anymore. They helped me into the helicopter, and it wasn't until we took off that my heart rate hit something like normal. All in all, the fire burned about 80 acres, but fire and rescue got water on it quickly enough and stopped it from spreading. There were no fatalities, though the tower I was in did need to be completely rebuilt. If I had been in there 10 minutes longer, they would have been cleaning up my remains with a shovel. At least that's what the park rangers said. I got pulled into the head ranger's office after the EMTs checked me out, and we had a long talk about how I had managed to get out of my tower in time, make it past the fire line, and still not call it in. I told him how the radio hadn't been functioning properly, and I'd simply run for my life. He commended me for my quick thinking when it came to getting out of danger, and seemed impressed with my performance through the Firewatch program. "Given that your tower was destroyed, we can't exactly send you back. We'll have to have the closest 2 towers keep an eye on your area, but I do have something if you're interested in a job." He had an open junior ranger position. It was part-time, minimum wage, and probably would come with a lot of overtime, but he promised me if I toughed it out for a year and passed all the training courses involved, he would promote me to full ranger after that year. Despite almost being burned to death and caught by a something or another, I still liked the woods and wanted to work there. I agreed, and he was as good as his word. A year later, I was a full park ranger, and a few weeks into my stint as junior ranger, the orders came for us to tear down the old Firewatch towers. I knocked Tower 13 down myself, and it felt pretty good. So that's my story. Maybe it isn't as weird as I thought it was, but it was pretty weird for me. If you want more, let me know. I'm sure I have some more weird tales from my past in one of Georgia's largest state parks. And when she came out of the bathroom, her entire class was gone. The 3rd grade class of 77 was never seen again, but they say sometimes you can still hear laughter in the woods outside. The door opened, and we all covered our eyes as Reggie grinned in at us. "I knew you guys would be telling stories again. You should have waited." Becky sighed, Randall chuffed unhappily, and I tried to smile as I told Reggie to close the door before someone saw him. We were in the old equipment storage shed by the playfield, and if an adult saw us, they would make us get out. We like to tell scary stories. The scarier the locale, the better. The old equipment shed had been unanimously decided upon because A, it was home to a lot of creepy crawlies, and B, it didn't let in a lot of light. We had to keep finding new places to tell stories because the ones we had got old pretty quick. You can tell stories in a place for only so long before it stops being scary, but also, sometimes it was because the teachers chased us out. The third reason was stepping in right now and grinning like a shot fox at us. Reggie was the weird kid of PS24, and he had earned that title honestly. It wasn't just because he was overweight to the point of being a blob, and it wasn't just because his hair was full of thick, gross-looking dandruff. It wasn't just because his dad was the janitor and seemed to love the job, or because he ate sauerkraut and onion sandwiches for lunch. The reason was that Reggie just emanated an aura of unsettledness. I got the feeling about him that I got about certain adults or dogs, the ones your parents tell you to stay away from. Reggie had a feeling of danger, of not rightness about him, and it made me uneasy. It didn't help that he had adopted us as his best friends this year. Becky, Randall, and I had been friends since kindergarten, but we had managed to avoid getting too close to Reggie. That had lasted until 4th grade, when we were in Miss Novak's class together. Reggie had decided that we were his best friends, He didn't have any regular friends, and he adopted us as his. This led to a year of smelling his sandwiches at lunch, having him follow us on our playground games, and listening to his wheezy, resting breath as he sat in our pod in class. We had hoped that we would be rid of him at the end of the year, but when our parents had signed us up for summer school care, a kind of after-school care during the summer, we had groaned as Reggie came in and saw us. He explained that the school had agreed to let him attend for free if his dad worked through the summer, and we all prayed that he would be in a different 5th grade class than us when next year rolled around. "Well, since you've already started telling stories, I got a good one," Reggie said. "It's the tale of the skinned raccoon." Reggie started to lay out his story about a skinned raccoon that had been seen one night while his dad worked late, and we all tried to pretend that it wasn't the most gruesome thing we had ever heard. The way he described the raccoon made me think that he had not only really seen it, but that he had probably skinned it himself. He said it had left little red footprints on the floor as it walked away, and his father had been angry when he found them. "We followed them all the way to the woods, but we never did find the raccoon." We all made an appreciatively scared noise, but I think we were all just hoping that he would let us move on. When Mrs. Simon pushed the door open a moment later, telling us this was off limits and we needed to leave, it was almost a relief. We left the shed, trying to kind of lose Reggie as we did, but we knew he'd find us again. It was impossible to hide from Reggie. He knew everywhere and everything about the school, all the hidden nooks and crannies. His dad had keys to any door in the school, and Reggie often borrowed some of them to get into places he shouldn't. His dad always covered for him, for some reason, so he never got in any trouble. It's weird, it was like his dad was scared of him sometimes, but he was a grown-up, and there was no reason that he should have been afraid of him. As we left the shed, running into the sunshine of the triple-digit day, Reggie said something that caught my interest. "That's a shame. I was gonna tell you guys about how I saw the missing kids a few nights ago." The missing kids. That was a big topic of discussion these days. Last year, 4 kids had gone missing from PS24. A 1st grader named Mary Edwards, a 3rd grader named George Tate, a kindergartner named Savannah Marcus, and a 5th grader named Robbie Fust. They had come to school and then just never left. The cameras at the school left a lot to be desired. That's what my dad said anyway, and they hadn't seen the kids leave school by any of the other exits either. My dad works for the police department, and he told me I needed to be extra safe until they found whoever was doing this. They suspected a teacher, but the question was, how would they get the kids out? If they were hiding the kids in the school somehow, then they would have been found by now, wouldn't they? They had searched the school a bunch. The disappearance had hung about the school like ghosts, and it sounded like the teachers were afraid that they might lose their job if it kept happening. I thought about what he had said until after lunch and decided I would just have to ask him. We were playing outside, the day a little cooler now that the sun was heading towards down, and Reggie was leaning against the fence and watching people as he often did. Reggie liked to just sit there and look at people, watching them as they went past, but he didn't make up stories about them or anything. He just watched them like the animals in the zoo watch fat kids. It was really weird. "So Reggie," I said, and Becky and Randall looked surprised since we never really talked to him and just accepted when he talked at us. "What do you mean that you were going to tell us about the missing kids?" Reggie turned his gaze away from a 1st grader who was chasing a ball with some effort, and his grin was downright predatory. "Oh yeah, I saw them the other night when Dad was working late." "Like you saw them, I said. "Like you know where they are." "Well, yeah," Reggie said. "They're under the school." I looked at Becky and Randall, and the two of them now looked as interested as I was. "Why haven't you told anyone?" Reggie shrugged. "No one asked." I could have smacked myself in the forehead. "Well, can you take us there?" Reggie was already grinning like a creepypasta monster, but I saw a glimmer pass over his eye, and I should have known to take it back. He wanted to show us. He wanted us to come with him, and I suddenly didn't want to go. But it didn't really matter if I wanted to or not. If there was a chance I could help my dad find those kids, I wanted to. Dad was worried about losing his job too if they didn't find somebody, and I didn't want that to happen. "Yeah, I'll show you. Come on." Reggie looked over at Mrs. Simon and Mrs. Gay to make sure they weren't paying attention, and the four of us headed towards the school. Reggie led us into a side door, through the third-grade hallway, and to the middle of the school to an area called the Square. The Square had been a part of PS24 since it was built in the 70s. It's an area of grass with a couple of small trees growing there. How the roots don't mess up the school, I don't know, but it's a place that a lot of kids usually go to between classes. There's a utility building in the middle of it, and that was where Reggie took us. He pulled out a long key from his short pants and unlocked the door, ushering us into the little building before closing us into total darkness. Then he pulled the chain on a light hanging from the ceiling, and we were left looking around a small square room of tools and other implements. "There's no one here," Becky said, looking around before looking back at Reggie with a scared look. "Well, yeah," Reggie said, grabbing an edge of what turned out to be a carpet. "Otherwise, they would have found them by now." He pulled the carpet back and revealed a hatch in the floor. It was flush against the ground, with no wheel or handle to poke out, and if you didn't know it was there, you would never even see the rug. Reggie squeezed a pair of handles and pulled the hatch up to reveal a ladder that led down into the earth. Reggie started climbing down like he'd done it 1,000 times before, and when he saw that we weren't following, he asked us if we were coming. "They're down here. If you want to see them, then you'll have to come down," he said, making his way down again as if the matter was settled. I looked at Randall, but he just shook his head and went for the door. "No way, man. This is way too weird for me." He put a hand on the knob, but when he turned it, the door was locked. I went to look for the flip lock that would let us out, but the other side of the knob had a keyhole. I'd never seen anything like this, and I realized that Reggie had the only key to the door. We were locked in with him, for better or worse, and he would need to let us out again. I looked at the hole and figured it beat being stuck in here. At least, we might find another way out if we went down. We descended the ladder slowly, the darkness thick around us. I tried turning on the light on my watch so we could see a little, but it didn't provide much light. We spread out, trying to find a switch, and when the light suddenly came on, I jumped. We were in a big room, like a storage unit, and it stretched the length of the grassy area above us. The ceiling was metal, the walls were metal, the floor was concrete, and the place was full of boxes. They were stacked up to the ceiling in some places, and I wondered what this place had been before it was just here to store things. We grouped up, moving around as we checked the room, and I saw something speckled on the floor. It looked like someone had spilled juice, or maybe paint, and as we came around a big stack of boxes, I saw another door. This one wasn't locked, and as it came open, we saw that it led down a long hallway that went further into the underground. "What is this place, anyway?" Becky asked, sounding a little scared as we followed the tunnel. "I'm not sure," Randall said, "but my mom told me that she used to go here, back in the early 80s, and people used to talk about there being bomb shelters or something under the school. She never saw them, but she said that was something the other kids told stories about." "You think that's what these are?" I asked, seeing a door coming up on our left. Randall shrugged. "Maybe, I guess. It would make sense for it to be in the very middle of the school." We tried the door, but it was locked tight. The next 3 were also locked, but the 5th door opened pretty easily and held what we were looking for. Well, not exactly what we were looking for, but we found the missing kids. The room had been some kind of workroom that had been turned into just another storage room. The boxes that the kids were lying on were drenched in blood. They were dead, thankfully. If they hadn't been, they would have been screaming. They were naked, their clothes lying in rags, and someone had been very busy. Their arms and legs had been removed, the bones broken cruelly. Their stomachs had been opened, their entrails hanging around them like snakes, and a few of them were missing eyes. The little girl, Mary, I thought, had her jaw pulled off and her tongue was missing. Becky started throwing up. Randall sounded like he wanted to scream, and when someone started laughing, I knew we'd stumbled into a trap. It was Reggie, his bulk blocking the door. He had a knife, the long kind you found in a kitchen, and he was grinning like a creep again. He just kept standing there, not trying to come after us, and it was clear that he realized, like we had, that we weren't going anywhere.
"Looks like you found the lost kids. Guess it's time to add 3 more to my little collection."
Come on, Reggie, I said, trying to talk our way out of this. This isn't funny. You got us pretty good with these Halloween decorations, but enough's enough. You win. Just let us out so we can... When he slashed me across my chest, slicing a long red line that split my t-shirt and my skin beneath, I hissed in pain and stumbled back.
"There's no getting out now. You're staying here forever. I meant to get you all before school ended, but there was never a good opportunity. Now, we can be friends forever. All 8 of us."
I was scared, but Randall had clearly gone past scared. He screamed like a cat that's been stomped on and ran at Reggie, shoving him as the big boy stabbed him in the shoulder. Even though he got him, Reggie was still off balance. He fell into some of the boxes and we scattered. Randall had gone back the way we came, Becky running after him, but I knew there was no way out that way. I went left, running into the unknown, and when someone roared like an angry beast behind me, I charged heedlessly. I don't know how long I ran. I don't know how far I ran, but when I slammed into a ladder, it was hard enough to make my eyes blur. I shook myself as I started to climb. I couldn't let him catch me. If he caught me, I'd be dead. I climbed and climbed and climbed, and when I got to the top, I pushed at the hatch and almost screamed when it wouldn't move. I pushed and pushed, getting a little bit of give, but it always came back down again. I couldn't make it budge, not even a little bit, and as I shoved at it, I started hearing something down the tunnel behind me. It wasn't loud, not like someone running, but it was feet coming up the concrete. I screamed and shoved at the hatch, feeling it give but not open. I squinted as something fell on my face, dirt or something, and I had to brace my back against the wall so I could use both hands. I got brief flashes of light as I shoved, just the slight glimmer from the edges, and when I heard the laughter from the bottom of the ladder, I kept shoving, praying to God to help me.
"Found you," Reggie sing-songed, putting his foot on the bottom rung of the ladder. "You might as well just come down. That hatch doesn't open. I don't know where it comes out at, but it's not gonna help you." He started climbing, and I felt like crying as I shoved at the hatch. My arms were hurting almost as badly as my chest, and I was afraid that he would get me before the latch could open. He would cut my legs, and I'd fall down the ladder. Then he'd do whatever he wanted, probably drag me back to his little room and finish me off. I shoved and shoved, yelling for help as he got closer and closer. He was climbing slow, on purpose, really stretching it out, and his words were muffled by the knife that he held in his teeth.
"Scream all you like. No one is coming to help."
But we both squinted when the hatch came slowly open, and I saw the faces of about 7 or 8 kids I recognized from the program. They helped me out, yelling for a teacher as Reggie retreated down the ladder. They had seen him, though. They knew he had been down there, and as the teachers came running, I was lying on the grass and breathing heavily. I was in a corner of the field, the back corner by the utility shed, and the kids had been playing kickball when they heard a loud shrieking noise that had come from that direction. It was the hinges on the door, long ago grown over with grass and covered with dirt. They came over and saw it opening and closing, and when they heard me yelling, they came to help pull me out.
The group of them had managed to fling it open, and Mrs. Simons was running to see what they were talking about. I breathed a sigh of relief. I told them what had happened, told them how Becky and Randall were still down there, and Mrs. Simons sent someone to call the police, but wouldn't go down there herself. If what you're saying is true, then it would be dangerous for us to go down there until the police get here. They came pretty quick, my dad with them, and I told them the story again and begged them to save my friends before he hurt them. They went down the ladder, guns drawn and flashlights out, and my dad and another officer told me to take them to the shed that Reggie had brought us down from. I took him there, but the door was standing open, and I knew that Reggie had fled. Dad went down the ladder, and to my relief, came up with Becky and Randall. They were scared, but unharmed. They told us how Reggie had come running for the front door and climbed up while they hid behind some boxes. They said he hadn't even noticed them as they ran, and he seemed pretty scared. They took the bodies out in bags, and the whole place was covered in tape. They got Reggie's dad, too, and he told them how he had known there was something off about his son, but he hadn't known what it was. I know it's not right to be afraid of your kid, but I was really afraid that he would kill me one night. The police decided he hadn't had anything to do with it, though I heard the school fired him for knowingly letting Reggie take his keys and get into restricted areas. As for Reggie, no one knows what happened to him. Wherever he ran to, he was never seen again. Now the ghost stories around school are about Reggie and how he's just waiting for his next chance to kill more kids. If they'd been down there in those tunnels that day, if they'd had stood face to face with the psycho while he contemplated killing us, they might not be so quick to tell stories about him.